Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The cabin was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where I could finally finish my novel. Instead, it became my prison. I remember the day I arrived, my old Subaru crunching over the gravel driveway. The cabin stood before me, a quaint wooden structure nestled among towering pines. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of earth and forest. I breathed deeply, feeling the tension of city life melting away. As I lugged my suitcase and boxes of research materials inside, I couldn't help but smile. The interior was rustic but cozy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by built-in bookshelves. A small kitchen occupied one corner, and a narrow staircase led to what I assumed was the bedroom. "Perfect," I murmured, already imagining the words flowing onto the page. The first few days were blissful. I'd wake with the sun, make a strong pot of coffee, and write until my fingers ached. In the afternoons, I'd take long walks in the surrounding woods, letting my mind wander and work out plot points. The evenings were spent curled up by the fire, editing and refining my work. It was on the fourth day that I first noticed something odd. I'd spent the morning writing, then decided to reward myself with a hike. When I returned, flushed and invigorated, I headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I reached for a glass, I froze. The stack of papers on the counter, my notes from the previous night, had been moved. I frowned, trying to remember if I'd touched them before leaving. But no, I was certain I'd left them in a neat pile next to my laptop. Now they were spread out, as if someone had been reading through them. A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. I must have bumped them without realizing, or maybe there was a draft I hadn't noticed. I gathered the papers, tapping them back into a tidy stack, and tried to push the incident from my mind. But over the next few days, more strange occurrences piled up. A chair in the living room was slightly out of place. My favorite mug was in a different cupboard than where I'd left it. Small things, easy to dismiss, but they needled at me, making me feel increasingly uneasy in what should have been my private retreat. I started double-checking the locks before bed, peering out the windows into the darkness, straining to see if anyone was out there. But the forest remained still and silent, revealing nothing. On the seventh night, I jolted awake, heart pounding. A noise had pulled me from sleep, a soft thud from downstairs. I lay frozen in bed, ears straining. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was in the cabin, moving as quietly as I could. I slipped out of bed. My hand trembled as I groped in the dark for something, anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a heavy flashlight. It would have to do. I crept down the stairs, wincing at every creak of the old wood. The main floor was dark and still. Had I imagined the noise? I was about to turn back when a floorboard groaned behind me. I whirled around, flashlight raised like a club, its beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and silence. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Is someone there?" No response, just the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I searched every room, every closet, but found no sign of an intruder. The doors were still locked, the windows secure. As the adrenaline faded, I felt foolish. It must have been the wind, or the house settling. I was letting my imagination run wild. But as I climbed back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the windows. In the cheerful light of day, my fears seemed ridiculous. I threw myself into my writing, determined to make up for lost time. It was late afternoon when I finally surfaced from my work, stretching my stiff muscles. I decided a walk would do me good, clear my head for the evening's writing session. The forest was beautiful, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. Birds called to each other overhead, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. I felt my spirits lifting with each step. I was so lost in thought that I almost missed it, a flash of movement in the trees. I squinted, trying to see what it was. A deer, maybe. But then I saw it again, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, darting between the trees, keeping pace with me. I quickened my step, heart racing. The figure matched my pace. I broke into a run, branches whipping at my face as I tore through the underbrush. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin, slamming the door behind me and throwing the lock. I stood there, gasping for breath, straining to hear any sound of pursuit. But there was nothing, just the usual forest sounds and my own ragged breathing. Had I imagined it? Was I going crazy? I spent the rest of the evening huddled on the couch, jumping at every sound. I tried to write, but the words wouldn't come. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside the windows, sent my heart racing anew. As night fell, I triple-checked every lock, then retreated to the bedroom. Sleep was elusive, but eventually, exhaustion won out. I don't know how long I slept before the sound woke me. My eyes flew open, body tense. There it was again, the slow, deliberate turning of the doorknob. I held my breath, praying I was dreaming, but the soft click of the latch releasing told me this was horribly real. The door swung open. A silhouette filled the doorway, backlit by the faint moonlight from the hall window. I could make out broad shoulders, the shape of a man, but no details of the face. I wanted to scream, to run, but terror held me paralyzed. I watched, helpless, as the figure took a step into the room. "Who are you?" I finally managed to croak out. "What do you want?" The figure paused, then spoke. The voice was low, gravelly, sending shivers down my spine. "I want what's mine," it said, confusion mingled with my fear. "What are you talking about? I don't have anything of yours." A chuckle, dark and humorless. "Oh, but you do. This cabin, these woods, they're mine, and you're trespassing." My mind raced. "That's impossible. I rented this cabin legally. I have paperwork." "Paperwork," the voice spat. "Meaningless. This land has belonged to my family for generations. No piece of paper changes that." He took another step forward. I pressed back against the headboard, searching desperately for an escape route. But he was blocking the only door, and the windows were too small to climb through. "Please," I said, hating the tremor in my voice. "I didn't know. I'll leave first thing in the morning. I promise." Another chuckle. "Oh, it's too late for that. You've seen too much." "Heard too much." "I haven't seen anything," I protested. "I don't know who you are. I can't identify you." "But you've been in my home." He cut me off. "Touched my things, left your scent everywhere." He took another menacing step forward. "No, I'm afraid I can't let you leave." Terror clawed at my throat. This couldn't be happening. Any moment now, I'd wake up and realize this was just a nightmare brought on by too much late-night writing. But the cold steel pressing against my temple was undeniably real. "Get up," the voice commanded. Shaking, I obeyed. He grabbed my arm, grip painfully tight, and marched me out of the bedroom and down the stairs. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. As we reached the front door, a thought struck me. I let my knees buckle, collapsing to the floor with a cry of pain. "My ankle," I gasped. "I think it's sprained." He cursed, loosening his grip for just a moment. It was all I needed. I twisted, driving my elbow into his solar plexus with all my strength. He wheezed, doubling over, and I took my chance. I scrambled to my feet and ran, yanking open the front door and plunging into the night. The forest was a maze of shadows, branches clawing at me as I ran blindly. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush, shouting threats that made my blood run cold. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like jelly. But the sounds of pursuit were growing fainter. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw no sign of him. Still, I didn't slow down. I ran until I saw lights in the distance, a highway, salvation. As I stumbled onto the shoulder of the road, a car approached. I waved my arms frantically, praying they'd stop. The car slowed, then pulled over. A concerned face peered out at me. "Are you all right, miss?" I shook my head, tears of relief streaming down my face. "No," I gasped. "Please, I need help. There's a man. He tried to." I couldn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need to. The driver, a kindly-looking older woman, opened the passenger door. "Get in," she said. "We'll go straight to the police station." As we drove away, I watched the dark line of trees recede in the side mirror. My sanctuary had become a nightmare, but I had escaped. I was safe. But as we rounded a bend, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the gloom, watching, waiting. I knew, with chilling certainty, that this wasn't over. He would find me again. The cabin was supposed to be my sanctuary. Instead, it had become the beginning of a waking nightmare. The laughter died in my throat as I saw the figure standing at the edge of the woods. In that moment, I knew our weekend getaway was about to become a fight for survival. It had started innocently enough. My 3 closest friends and I had been planning this trip for months, a chance to escape the chaos of our daily lives and reconnect in the peaceful solitude of nature. We'd found the perfect spot, a secluded cabin nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest town or cell phone signal. As we pulled up to the cabin on Friday afternoon, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. It was exactly the escape we'd been craving. "This is perfect," Sarah exclaimed as she hopped out of the car, stretching her arms above her head. I had to agree. The cabin was rustic but charming, with a wide front porch and large windows that promised plenty of natural light. A stone chimney suggested cozy evenings by the fire. We unloaded the car, laughing and joking as we carried in our bags and supplies. The interior of the cabin was just as inviting as the outside, all warm wood and comfortable furniture. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the living room, and a spacious kitchen promised plenty of room for cooking and hanging out. That first evening was everything we'd hoped for. We grilled burgers on the back deck, sharing stories and catching up as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink. After dinner, we gathered around the fireplace, opening a bottle of wine and playing cards late into the night. It wasn't until the next day that things started to feel off. We'd spent the morning hiking, exploring the trails that wound through the surrounding forest. The woods were beautiful, sunlight filtering through the canopy and dappling the forest floor. But as we got deeper into the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was never anything, just trees and underbrush. "You okay?" Mike asked, noticing my unease. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just thought I heard something, probably just an animal." But the feeling persisted, even after we returned to the cabin. As afternoon faded into evening, I found myself constantly peering out the windows, searching the tree line for something. I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong, but a sense of unease had settled over me like a heavy blanket. We were sitting around the fire pit that night, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories, when I saw it, a flicker of movement just beyond the circle of firelight. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but the darkness beyond our little oasis was impenetrable. "Guys," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I think there's something out there." The others fell silent, following my gaze. For a long moment, we all stared into the darkness, straining to see or hear anything out of the ordinary. "I don't see anything," Tom said finally. "You're letting those ghost stories get to you." But I could tell by the tension in his voice that he wasn't as certain as he pretended to be. We all huddled a little closer to the fire, our eyes darting nervously to the shadows. It was Sarah who saw it next, a figure, standing just at the edge of the woods. In the flickering firelight, it was hard to make out details, but it was unmistakably human. "Oh my God," she breathed, grabbing my arm. "Look." We all turned, and I felt my blood run cold. The figure was motionless, watching us. As we stared, frozen in shock and fear, two more shapes emerged from the trees to flank the first. "Who are they?" Mike whispered. "What do they want?" Before anyone could answer, the figures began to move towards us with purposeful strides. As they got closer, I could see they were all men, dressed in dark clothes. But it was their faces that made my heart stop. Each one wore a mask, featureless and blank in the firelight. "Run!" Tom shouted, breaking the spell that had held us paralyzed. We scrambled to our feet, abandoning everything as we raced for the cabin. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, getting closer with every second. We burst through the door, slamming it shut and throwing the lock. Mike and Tom shoved a heavy bookcase in front of it for good measure. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah cried, her face pale with fear. Before anyone could answer, a heavy thud shook the door. Then another. They were trying to break in. "We need to call for help," I said, fumbling for my phone. But as I'd feared, there was no signal. We were on our own. The pounding on the door grew louder, more insistent. I could hear wood splintering. "They're going to get in," Mike said, his voice tight with fear. "We need a weapon, something to defend ourselves." We scattered, searching desperately for anything we could use. I ran to the kitchen, yanking open drawers until I found a large knife. It felt pathetically inadequate against the threat outside, but it was better than nothing. A crash from the living room told me the door had given way. Heavy footsteps and the sound of furniture being overturned filled the air. I pressed myself against the wall next to the kitchen doorway, knife clutched in my trembling hand. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they must be able to hear it. A shadow fell across the floor as one of the intruders entered the kitchen. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. But then Sarah screamed from somewhere in the cabin, and the man turned. It was now or never. With a cry that was equal parts terror and determination, I launched myself at him, driving the knife towards his back. But he was faster than I'd anticipated. He spun, catching my wrist in a grip like iron. The knife clattered to the floor as he twisted my arm behind my back, his other hand clamping over my mouth to stifle my scream. He dragged me into the living room, where I saw the others had also been captured. We were forced to our knees, hands zip-tied behind our backs. One of the men, taller than the others, stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice was muffled by the mask, but the menace in it was clear. "Where is it?" he demanded. We looked at each other in confusion. "Where's what?" Tom asked. "We don't have anything." The man backhanded him, the sound shockingly loud in the quiet cabin. "Don't play dumb," he snarled. "We know you have it. Tell us where it is, or things are going to get very unpleasant for you." "Please," Sarah sobbed. "We don't know what you're talking about. We're just here on vacation." The man tilted his head, studying us. "You really don't know," he said finally. It wasn't a question. He turned to his companions. "Search the place. Tear it apart if you have to. It has to be here somewhere." For the next hour, we watched helplessly as they ransacked the cabin. They upended furniture, ripped open cushions, pulled books from shelves. Whatever they were looking for, they were determined to find it. But as the search dragged on, their frustration grew palpable. They conferred in low voices, occasionally casting glances our way. Finally, the leader approached us again. "Last chance," he said, pulling a gun from his waistband. "Where is it?" "We don't know," I cried, tears streaming down my face. "Please, we're telling the truth. We don't have anything." He raised the gun, and I squeezed my eyes shut, certain this was the end. But before he could pull the trigger, a new sound cut through the night. Sirens, growing louder by the second. The men froze, looking at each other in panic. Then, without a word, they bolted for the door, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had appeared. Moments later, the cabin was flooded with light as police cars pulled up outside. It turned out the owners had installed a silent alarm system after a break-in the previous year. When the intruders had forced their way in, it had automatically alerted the authorities. As the police cut us free and took our statements, I found myself shaking uncontrollably. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me feeling hollow and exhausted. Later, we learned that the cabin's previous renters had been part of a smuggling operation. They'd hidden a fortune in stolen diamonds somewhere on the property before being arrested. The men who'd attacked us were their associates, convinced we were there to retrieve the loot. We never did find out if the diamonds were really hidden at the cabin. After that night, none of us ever wanted to set foot in those woods again. Our relaxing getaway had turned into a nightmare, leaving scars that would take a long time to heal. Now, years later, I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, the image of those blank masks vivid in my mind. Our escape into nature had become a harsh reminder of how quickly paradise can turn into hell. The moment I saw the deliberately broken branch, I knew I wasn't alone. What I didn't know was that my peaceful camping trip was about to become a terrifying game of cat and mouse. I'd been looking forward to this solo camping trip in the Colorado Rockies for months. As a software developer in Denver, my days were filled with endless lines of code, fluorescent lights, and the constant ping of notifications. I craved the solitude and silence of the wilderness, a chance to disconnect and recharge. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. I found a perfect spot to park my van, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a babbling creek nearby. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles and wild sage. As I set up my camp, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. That night, I sat by my campfire, watching the flames dance as the stars came out overhead. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the gentle rustle of wind through the trees. I breathed deeply, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. I slept soundly that night, lulled by the quiet of the forest. The next morning, I woke early, eager to explore my surroundings. After a quick breakfast, I set out on a hike, following a faint trail that wound its way up the mountainside. The views were breathtaking. From the higher vantage points, I could see for miles, endless waves of green forest, broken only by the occasional glint of a distant lake or the rocky peak of a mountain. I took my time, stopping often to take photos or simply soak in the scenery. It wasn't until I was heading back to camp that I noticed something odd. A branch lay across the path, freshly broken. I frowned, certain it hadn't been there on my way up. I glanced around, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. No bird song, no rustling in the underbrush, just silence. A chill ran down my spine, despite the warm afternoon sun. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to the relative safety of my van. Back at camp, I tried to shake off my unease. I was being paranoid, letting my imagination run wild after too much time in the city. I busied myself with making dinner, but I couldn't quite relax. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, peering into the deepening shadows of the forest. As night fell, my anxiety grew. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves seemed magnified. I built my fire higher than necessary, taking comfort in its warm glow. But even as I sat close to the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I slept fitfully that night, starting awake at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but relieved. In the light of day, my fears seemed silly, but as I stepped out of my van, my heart sank. There, in the soft earth around my campsite, were footprints, and they weren't mine. My hands shook as I examined them. They were large, much bigger than my own, and the tread pattern was unfamiliar. Someone had been walking around my camp while I slept. I spent the morning in a state of heightened alertness, jumping at every sound. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but another part, the part that had faced down impossible coding deadlines and system crashes, was determined not to let fear drive me away. So I stayed, but I was careful. I went for another hike, but this time I left obvious signs of the direction I was heading, then doubled back along a different route. When I returned to my camp, I found more evidence that someone had been there, a little pile of rocks that hadn't been there before, arranged in a way that was too deliberate to be natural. That night, I didn't build a fire. Instead, I sat in my van, windows covered, watching the darkness through a small gap in the curtains. Hours passed, and my eyelids grew heavy. Just as I was about to give up and try to sleep, I saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. I held my breath, squinting into the darkness. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I saw it again. A shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the trees. A figure, moving with slow, deliberate steps towards my van. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it must be audible outside the van. I watched, paralyzed, as the figure drew closer. In the faint moonlight, I could make out the shape of a man, tall and broad-shouldered. He was dressed in dark clothes that blended with the night, making him seem almost like a part of the darkness itself. He circled my van slowly, pausing at each window. I stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. What did he want? Was he just curious about the van in his territory? Or did he have more sinister intentions? After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he retreated back to the tree line. But he didn't leave. Instead, he just stood there, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept my vigil at the window, watching him watch me. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, he finally melted back into the forest. I wasted no time. As soon as I was sure he was gone, I threw my things into the van and got ready to leave. But when I tried to start the engine, my blood ran cold. It wouldn't turn over. Somehow, in the night, my battery had died. Panic clawed at my throat. I was trapped. I forced myself to think logically. I had a portable battery pack for emergencies. If I could just hook it up, I might be able to get enough juice to start the van. But it was in the storage compartment, outside. I peered out the windows, searching for any sign of the watcher. The forest seemed empty, peaceful in the early morning light. Taking a deep breath, I opened the van door as quietly as I could and slipped out. I had just reached the storage compartment when I heard it, the snap of a twig behind me. I whirled around, and there he was, standing at the edge of the clearing. In the light of day, I could see him clearly for the first time. He was older than I'd expected, with graying hair and a weathered face. His clothes were worn and dirty, like he'd been living in the wilderness for a long time. We stared at each other, neither moving. His eyes were intense, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite read. Was it anger, curiosity, madness? "What do you want?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. He tilted his head, regarding me silently. Then, slowly, he raised his hand. I flinched, expecting a weapon, but instead he pointed at my van. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "This is my place." I swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't know. I'll leave, I promise. I just need to get my van started." He watched as I fumbled with the battery pack, my hands shaking so badly I could barely connect the cables. All the while, I was acutely aware of his eyes on me, watching my every move. Finally, blessedly, the engine roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I threw the battery pack into the van and leapt into the driver's seat. As I accelerated away, I caught one last glimpse of the man in my rearview mirror. He hadn't moved, just stood there watching me go. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, my heart still racing. As the miles between me and that clearing grew, the fear began to fade, replaced by a mix of relief and lingering unease. I never went back to that spot in the Rockies, but sometimes, when I'm working late at night in my brightly lit office, I find myself thinking about that man. Who was he? How long had he been out there? And what would have happened if my van hadn't started? The wilderness I'd sought for peace had shown me a darker side of solitude, a reminder that even in the most remote places, we're never truly alone. My escape into nature had become a stark reminder of the thin line between solitude and isolation, between peace and fear. Now, when I feel the need to disconnect, I stick to crowded campgrounds and well-traveled trails. I've learned that sometimes the presence of others isn't an intrusion, but a comfort, and while I may have lost my taste for true solitude, I gained a newfound appreciation for the connections that keep us tethered to the world, even when we're trying to escape it. I never thought the Utah desert would be the place where I'd face my own mortality. But as I stared down the barrel of a gun, I realized that sometimes solitude comes at a deadly price. The trip had started as a much-needed escape from my hectic life in San Francisco. As a high-powered executive, my days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and endless email chains. The constant connectivity was suffocating, and I craved nothing more than silence and solitude. That's how I found myself driving my camper van deep into the Utah desert, far from any sign of civilization. The landscape was breathtaking, towering red rock formations, vast expanses of sand, and a sky so big and blue it seemed unreal. As I navigated the winding dirt roads, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. I found the perfect spot just as the sun was beginning to set. It was a small plateau overlooking a stunning valley, with no other vehicles or campsites in sight. Perfect. I parked my van, orienting it to catch the sunrise in the morning, and stepped out to stretch my legs. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and dust. I took a deep breath, savoring the silence. No car horns, no notification pings, no voices. Just the whisper of the wind and the occasional call of a distant bird. I set up my camp chair and watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. As darkness fell, the stars came out in force, more than I'd ever seen in my light-polluted city life. I sat there for hours, marveling at the Milky Way streaking across the sky, feeling small and insignificant in the best possible way. When I finally crawled into my van to sleep, I felt more relaxed than I had in years. I drifted off easily, lulled by the absolute quiet of the desert night. I'm not sure what woke me, some animal instinct, perhaps, alerting me to danger before my conscious mind could process it. My eyes snapped open, heart racing, though I didn't know why. Then I heard it, voices, low and urgent, coming from outside my van. I froze, barely daring to breathe. This couldn't be happening. I was miles from anywhere. How could there be people here? Slowly, carefully, I peered out the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were men out there. 4, no, 5 of them. They were dressed in dark clothes, and even in the dim moonlight, I could see they were armed. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as they moved around my van. They seemed to be looking for something, their movements purposeful and agitated. "Check inside," I heard one of them say, his voice gruff and impatient. My heart nearly stopped. I had nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. I was trapped. The door handle rattled, and I squeezed my eyes shut, praying this was just a nightmare. But the sound of the door being wrenched open was all too real. A bright light hit my face, and I blinked against the sudden glare. "Well, well," a voice said. "What do we have here?" Rough hands grabbed me, dragging me out of the van. I stumbled, my legs weak with fear, as they shoved me to my knees in the dirt. "Please," I gasped. "I don't have anything valuable. Take whatever you want, just please don't hurt me." One of the men, taller than the rest and clearly the leader, crouched down in front of me. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze. "We're not here for your valuables, sweetheart," he said, his voice cold. "We're here because you saw something you shouldn't have." Confusion mixed with my fear. "What? I didn't see anything, I swear. I just got here yesterday." He stood up abruptly, turning to his companions. "Search the van. Every inch. If she's got any cameras or phones, I want them." As they tore apart my temporary home, throwing my belongings carelessly onto the ground, my mind raced. What could they possibly think I'd seen? I'd been alone since I arrived, hadn't I? Then a terrible thought struck me. Earlier that evening, as I'd watched the sunset, I'd seen a small plane flying low over the desert. It had seemed odd at the time. Who would be flying out here? But I'd dismissed it as probably some rich tourist taking an aerial tour. But what if it wasn't? What if I'd inadvertently witnessed something illegal? Drug smuggling, maybe, or some other criminal activity? My suspicions were confirmed when one of the men emerged from the van, holding my camera. "Boss, look at this," he said, thumbing through the photos. "She's got pictures of the drop." The leader snatched the camera, scowling as he looked at the screen. Then his eyes met mine, and I saw murder in them. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little spy," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "No," I cried. "I'm not a spy, I swear. I'm just here on vacation. I didn't know what I was photographing. I was just taking pictures of the sunset." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded to one of his men. "Tie her up. We'll take her with us and figure out what to do later." As they bound my hands behind my back, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. This couldn't be happening. Just hours ago, I'd been relishing my solitude, and now I was being kidnapped by armed criminals in the middle of nowhere. They shoved me into the back of a waiting SUV, my camera tossed in beside me. As we drove off into the night, leaving my van behind, I tried to stay calm and think rationally. I had to find a way out of this, but how? I had no idea where we were going, and even if I could somehow escape, I was in the middle of the desert with no supplies and no way to call for help. We drove for what felt like hours, bouncing along dirt roads that seemed to lead nowhere. Finally, we came to a stop at what looked like an abandoned gas station, its windows boarded up and its sign long since faded away. They dragged me inside, the musty air thick with dust and the smell of old gasoline. In what used to be the store area, they tied me to a chair, the ropes biting into my skin. The leader pulled up another chair, sitting down in front of me. In the dim light filtering through the cracks in the boards, I could finally see his face. He was older than I'd expected, with deep lines etched into his weathered skin and cold, gray eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Now," he said, his voice quiet but menacing, "you're going to tell me exactly who you're working for and what you know about our operation." "I'm not working for anyone," I insisted, my voice cracking with fear. "I told you, I'm just on vacation. I'm an executive from San Francisco. I came out here to get away from work, not to do more of it." He studied me for a long moment, then stood up abruptly. "We'll see about that," he said, turning to leave. Left alone in the dusty darkness, I felt panic begin to set in. What were they going to do to me? Would anyone even realize I was missing? I'd told my assistant I was going off-grid for a week. It could be days before anyone started looking for me. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. I drifted in and out of an uneasy sleep, jolted awake by every small sound. My throat was parched, my stomach cramping with hunger. But worse than the physical discomfort was the crushing weight of fear and uncertainty. I'm not sure how long I'd been there when I heard the commotion outside. Shouts, the sound of running feet, and then, incredibly, sirens. The door burst open, and for a moment I was blinded by flashlights. Then I heard the most beautiful words I'd ever heard. "Police, don't move." As they untied me, gently helping me to my feet, one of the officers explained what had happened. A hiker had stumbled upon my abandoned van and called it in. When they investigated and found signs of a struggle, they'd launched a full-scale search. It turned out the men who'd kidnapped me were part of a drug smuggling ring that had been operating in the area for months. My innocent sunset photos had captured their plane making a drop, and they'd panicked. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, sipping water and trying to process everything that had happened, I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. I'd come out to the desert seeking solitude, and instead I'd found myself at the center of a criminal conspiracy. The officer taking my statement looked at me quizzically. "Something funny, ma'am." I shook my head, smiling ruefully, just thinking about how sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor. As we drove away from the scene, the desert stretching out around us, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Relief, certainly, and lingering fear, but also a strange sense of gratitude. I'd wanted to disconnect from my life, to feel something real and immediate. Well, I'd certainly gotten that. I knew it would take time to process this experience, to deal with the trauma and fear. But I also knew that I'd gained a new perspective. The solitude I'd craved had nearly cost me everything, but it had also shown me how connected we all are, how the actions of strangers can intersect in ways we never expect. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I made a silent promise to myself. I would never take my safety, or my connections to others, for granted again. Sometimes, it takes facing the vast emptiness of the desert and the darkness that can lurk within it to truly appreciate the value of human connection. I never thought I'd fear the sound of knocking, but when it came in the dead of night, miles from civilization, I knew our lives were about to change forever. My wife, Emily, and I had been planning this RV trip for months. Both of us worked high-stress jobs in the city, me as a financial analyst, her as an ER nurse. We were desperate for a break, a chance to reconnect with each other and with nature. The idea of hitting the open road, with no set destination and no schedule to keep, was intoxicating. We'd rented a sleek, modern RV, nothing like the clunky behemoths I remembered from childhood trips. This one had all the comforts of home, a cozy bed, a functional kitchenette, even a tiny bathroom with a shower. It was perfect for our needs. Our first few days on the road were blissful. We meandered through small towns, hiked in state parks, and spent our evenings stargazing and talking like we hadn't in years. I could feel the tension melting away from both of us with each passing mile. On our fourth night, we decided to try some true boondocking, camping off-grid, away from established campgrounds. We found a beautiful spot off a rarely used Forest Service road, surrounded by towering pines and with a babbling creek nearby. It was idyllic, the kind of place you see on postcards. As the sun set, we sat outside the RV in our camp chairs, sharing a bottle of wine and marveling at the riot of stars overhead. The only sounds were the gentle gurgle of the creek and the occasional hoot of an owl. "This is perfect," Emily sighed, leaning her head on my shoulder. "Why don't we do this more often?" I kissed the top of her head, inhaling the scent of her shampoo mixed with wood smoke from our campfire. "We should," I agreed. "Maybe it's time to reevaluate our priorities." We talked late into the night, dreaming of a simpler life, one with more adventures and less stress. When we finally crawled into bed, I felt more at peace than I had in years. I'm not sure what time it was when the knocking started. It pulled me from a deep sleep, leaving me disoriented and groggy. At first, I thought I'd dreamed it, but then it came again. 3 sharp raps on the RV's door. Emily stirred beside me. "What's that?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. I don't know, I whispered back, suddenly very awake. My heart was pounding. Who could possibly be out here at this hour? I slipped out of bed, moving as quietly as I could to the window. Peering out, I could make out a figure standing by our door in the pale moonlight. It was a man, his features indistinct in the darkness. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Hello," a voice called out. "Is anyone there? Please, I need help." I glanced at Emily. She was sitting up in bed now, her eyes wide with fear. I could see the conflict on her face, her instinct as a nurse to help someone in need warring with the very real danger of our situation. "What should we do?" I mouthed to her. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "We should see what he needs," she whispered. "But be careful." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Then, keeping the chain on the door, I opened it a crack. The man outside looked terrible. He was disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty. His face was streaked with what looked like dried blood. "Oh, thank God," he said when he saw me. "Please, I've been in an accident. My car went off the road a few miles back. I've been walking for hours trying to find help." I felt a pang of sympathy. If he was telling the truth, he must be terrified and in pain. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind urged caution. "Are you hurt?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. He nodded, wincing. "I think I might have broken my arm," and I hit my head pretty hard. I glanced back at Emily. She was already pulling on clothes, her nurse instincts kicking in. "We should help him," she said softly. Against my better judgment, I undid the chain and opened the door fully. "Come in," I said. "My wife's a nurse. She can take a look at you." The man's relief was palpable as he stepped into the RV. "Thank you," he said fervently. "I didn't think anyone would be out here. I'm John, by the way." As Emily began examining him, asking questions about his injuries, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Something about this situation felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on why. "Can you tell us more about the accident?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. John's eyes flicked to mine, then away. "It was stupid," he said. "I was driving too fast on those curvy roads, took a turn too sharp and went right off the edge." It was a plausible story, but something in his tone didn't ring true. I found myself scanning the RV, making sure I knew where all our potential weapons were: the heavy flashlight by the door, the kitchen knives in their block. Emily finished her examination, looking troubled. "I don't see any signs of a head injury," she said slowly. "And your arm doesn't appear to be broken. Are you sure you were in an accident?" John's demeanor changed in an instant. The grateful, injured traveler vanished, replaced by something cold and dangerous. His eyes hardened as he looked between us. Well," he said, his voice low and menacing, "I was really hoping we could do this the easy way." Before I could react, he pulled a knife from his pocket, the blade glinting in the low light of the RV. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his tone conversational but with an undercurrent of threat. "You're going to give me all your cash, any jewelry, and the keys to this nice RV. Then you're going to walk into those woods and keep walking until sunrise. If you do that, everyone gets to live. If not..." He let the threat hang in the air. My mind raced. I knew we had a can of bear spray in one of the cupboards, a precaution we'd taken for hiking. If I could just reach it. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's not do anything rash. We'll give you what you want." I moved slowly towards the cupboard, making a show of reaching for our wallets. John watched me warily, the knife still pointed at Emily. Just as my hand closed around the can of bear spray, John must have realized what I was doing. He lunged forward with a snarl, knife flashing. I don't remember consciously deciding to act. One moment I was reaching for the spray, the next I was turning, depressing the nozzle, aiming it straight at John's face. The effect was instantaneous. He screamed, dropping the knife and clawing at his eyes. Emily, quick thinking as always, grabbed the flashlight and brought it down hard on his head. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. We stood there for a moment, panting, the acrid smell of the bear spray burning our nostrils. Then Emily burst into tears, the shock and fear finally overwhelming her. I pulled her into my arms, my own body shaking with adrenaline. "It's okay," I murmured into her hair. "We're okay. We're safe." The next few hours passed in a blur. We tied John up with some rope we had for securing our bikes, then drove like hell until we found a town with a police station. The officers were shocked by our story, but quickly sprang into action. It turned out John was wanted in 3 states for similar crimes, breaking into RVs and robbing travelers in remote areas. We'd been lucky to escape with our lives. As we sat in a diner later that day, both of us too wired to sleep despite our exhaustion, Emily reached across the table and took my hand. "I don't think I want to go back to the ER," she said quietly. "After last night, I don't think I can face that kind of danger and uncertainty every day anymore." I nodded, understanding completely. "Maybe it's time for both of us to make some changes," I agreed. We spent the rest of our trip in proper campgrounds, surrounded by other RVs and the comforting sounds of families enjoying nature. But despite the fear we'd experienced, we didn't cut our trip short. If anything, our brush with danger had made us more appreciative of the beauty around us, more aware of the preciousness of each moment. When we returned home, we both put in our notices at work. We sold our house, bought our own RV, and hit the road full time. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments of doubt. But every time I looked at Emily, every time we discovered a new beautiful spot or met fellow travelers with amazing stories, I knew we'd made the right choice. Our peaceful night in the woods had turned into a nightmare, but it had also been a wake-up call. Life was too short to spend it stressed and unfulfilled. Sometimes, it takes facing your worst fears to find the courage to live your best life. Now, years later, when I hear a knock on our RV door, I no longer feel fear. Instead, I feel excitement, wondering what new friend or adventure might be waiting on the other side. The scream that pierced the night air turned my peaceful camping trip into a waking nightmare. I never imagined that my quest for solitude would lead me to witness something so terrifying. I'd been planning this solo camping trip for months. As a high school English teacher, my days were filled with noise. The constant chatter of students, the shrill ring of bells, the never-ending ping of emails. I craved silence, a chance to hear my own thoughts again. The spot I chose was perfect. A small, secluded campsite near a serene lake in Northern California. It was off the beaten path, requiring a good hour's hike from where I'd parked my car. The extra effort meant I'd have the place to myself, away from the RVs and family campgrounds that dotted the more accessible areas. As I set up my tent that first afternoon, I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease. The air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and wildflowers. Birds chirped in the distance, and I could hear the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. It was exactly what I needed. I spent the day hiking, taking in the stunning views and reveling in the solitude. As night fell, I built a small fire and sat beside it, reading a book I'd been meaning to get to for months. The crackling of the flames and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only sounds breaking the perfect silence. It was close to midnight when I decided to turn in. I doused the fire carefully and crawled into my tent, zipping myself into my sleeping bag with a contented sigh. Despite the hard ground beneath me, I fell asleep almost instantly, lulled by the quiet of the forest. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when the sound jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, a high, keening wail that sent chills down my spine. But as I lay there, heart pounding, I heard it again. This time, there was no mistaking it for anything but what it was, a scream. I sat up, fumbling for my flashlight with shaking hands. The scream came again, louder this time, and unmistakably human. It was coming from the direction of the lake. For a moment, I froze, indecision paralyzing me. Should I investigate, or stay put and hope whatever was happening would resolve itself? The sensible part of my brain argued for staying in the tent. I was alone in the wilderness and with no cell signal and no way to call for help if I got into trouble. But then the scream came again, this time with words, "Help, please, somebody help me." I couldn't ignore that. Whatever was happening, someone was in trouble. I had to at least try to help. With trembling fingers, I pulled on my boots and jacket. I grabbed my flashlight and the small canister of bear spray I'd brought as a precaution. Taking a deep breath to steel my nerves, I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the night. The forest was different in the darkness. The friendly trees that had provided shade during the day now loomed ominously, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. My flashlight beam seemed feeble against the pressing blackness. I made my way towards the lake, straining my ears for any sound. For a long moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves under my feet. Then, just as I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing, I heard it. A splash, followed by a choked-off cry. Moving as quickly as I dared in the dark, I pushed through a stand of bushes and found myself on the lakeshore. My flashlight beam skittered across the water's surface, reflecting eerily off the small waves. That's when I saw them. Two figures in the water, about 50 yards from shore. One was thrashing wildly, arms flailing. The other seemed to be holding the first one down. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice sounding thin and scared in the vast darkness. "What's going on out there?" For a moment, everything stopped. The thrashing figure went still. The other one turned slowly, and I saw the glint of eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible, the figure started moving towards shore, towards me. Panic gripped me. I backpedaled, nearly tripping over a rock in my haste. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get back to my tent, to my car, to safety. But my legs felt like lead, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure rapidly approaching the shore. As it got closer, I could make out more details. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered. He moved with an unnatural grace through the water, barely making a splash. And his eyes, they seemed to glow with an inner light, fixed on me with predatory intensity. He reached the shallows, and I finally found the strength to turn and run. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear him behind me, moving much faster than should have been possible. I burst into my campsite, lungs burning, legs aching. My tent was just ahead. If I could just reach it, grab my keys, maybe I could make it to my car. A hand clamped down on my shoulder, spinning me around. I found myself face to face with my pursuer. Up close, he looked almost normal. Just a man in his 40s, with graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard. But his eyes, they were completely black. No whites visible at all. "Well," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "This is unfortunate. I do so hate to have witnesses." I opened my mouth. Whether to scream or plead, I'm not sure, but no sound came out. My whole body was trembling, my mind unable to process what was happening. He tilted his head, studying me with those impossible eyes. "You should have stayed in your tent, you know. Minded your own business. But humans, you're always so nosy, aren't you? Always have to investigate." "What are you?" I managed to stammer out. He smiled, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp to be human. "I'm hungry," he said simply. "And you, my dear, look absolutely delicious." In that moment, survival instinct kicked in. Without conscious thought, my hand came up, the canister of bear spray clenched in my fist. I depressed the trigger, aiming right for his face. He howled, an inhuman sound of pain and rage, as the spray hit him. His grip on me loosened, and I took my chance. I ran, harder and faster than I'd ever run in my life. I don't remember much of that frantic flight through the forest. Somehow, driven by pure adrenaline and terror, I found my way back to my car. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, but finally, blessedly, the engine roared to life. As I sped down the mountain road, I kept expecting to see those glowing eyes in my rearview mirror. But there was nothing, just darkness and the normal nighttime forest sounds. I drove straight through until morning, not stopping until I reached the nearest sizable town. There, hands still shaking, I walked into the police station to report what had happened. They didn't believe me, of course. They thought I was drunk, or on drugs, or simply hysterical. They sent a patrol car to check out the campsite, but of course, they found nothing. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, just an abandoned tent and a half-empty can of bear spray. I never went camping again after that night. My students sometimes ask me why I get so nervous around large bodies of water, or why I insist on keeping the lights on even during daytime video presentations. I usually make up some excuse about a bad childhood experience. The truth is, I can't bring myself to talk about what really happened. Who would believe me? Sometimes, I'm not even sure I believe it myself. But then I'll catch a glimpse of unnaturally dark eyes in a crowd, or hear a too smooth voice on the radio, and that old terror comes rushing back. I went into those woods seeking silence and solitude. What I found instead was a nightmare that shattered my understanding of the world. Now, years later, I still find myself lying awake at night, wondering about that other figure in the water. Was it another victim? Another? Whatever that thing was? And most chilling of all, how many others are out there, lurking in the dark waters of secluded lakes, waiting for unsuspecting campers to wander too close to shore? I used to love the peace and quiet of nature. Now I find comfort in the noise and bustle of the city, because in the silence, in the darkness, that's where the real monsters lurk. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them again. The moment I saw the unfamiliar truck, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. Our quest for solitude had led us straight into a nightmare. My best friend Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months. Both of us were burnt out from our high-pressure jobs in the city. Me as a software engineer, her as a corporate lawyer. We needed an escape, a chance to disconnect from the world and recharge our batteries. We'd chosen the Appalachian Mountains for our getaway, drawn by the promise of stunning views and complete isolation. Sarah had found a website that listed GPS coordinates for remote camping spots, far off the beaten path. It seemed perfect, a way to truly get away from it all. We set out early on a Friday morning, my old Subaru packed to the brim with camping gear and enough food to last us a week. The drive was beautiful, winding roads taking us deeper into the mountains. As cell service dropped away, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. By mid-afternoon, we'd reached the turnoff for our chosen spot. The narrow dirt road was rough, jostling us around as we climbed higher into the mountains. But the views were worth it, sweeping vistas of forested peaks stretching as far as the eye could see. "This is amazing," Sarah breathed, leaning out the window to take it all in. "I can't believe we have this all to ourselves." I grinned, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. "I know. It's perfect." We found our spot just as the sun was starting to dip towards the horizon. It was a small clearing, sheltered by towering pines, with a babbling creek nearby. We couldn't have asked for a more idyllic setting. We set up camp efficiently, working together to pitch the tent and gather firewood. As darkness fell, we sat by our campfire, roasting marshmallows and talking like we hadn't in years. The only sounds were the crackling of the flames and the gentle murmur of the creek. "We should do this more often," Sarah said, leaning back in her camp chair with a contented sigh. "I'd forgotten how good it feels to just be." I nodded, feeling the same sense of peace. "Agreed. Maybe we need to reevaluate our life choices when we get back. We stayed up late, watching the stars wheel overhead and marveling at how bright they were away from the city lights. When we finally crawled into our tent, I fell asleep almost instantly, lulled by the fresh mountain air and the sound of the creek. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up. Something had pulled me from sleep, some instinct warning me that something wasn't right. I lay still for a moment, listening intently. Then I heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel, the low rumble of an engine. I sat up, my heart starting to race. "Sarah," I whispered, shaking her awake. "There's someone here." She blinked at me groggily. "What? That's impossible. We're miles from anywhere." But then she heard it too, car doors slamming, voices carrying through the still night air. We scrambled out of the tent, fear making us clumsy. In the pale moonlight, I could see a truck parked at the edge of our clearing. 3 men were getting out, their voices loud and rough. "Hey," one of them shouted when he saw us. "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" Sarah and I exchanged a panicked glance. This wasn't how this trip was supposed to go. "We're just camping," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "We didn't realize this spot was taken." The men approached, and I felt my stomach drop. They were big, intimidating, and the way they were looking at us made my skin crawl. "This is private property," the leader said, his voice menacing. "You're trespassing." Sarah, always the lawyer, spoke up. "I'm sorry, but that's not possible. We checked before we came. This is public land." The man's face darkened. "Are you calling me a liar, girl?" I stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Look, we're sorry for the misunderstanding. We'll pack up and leave first thing in the morning, okay?" For a moment, I thought it had worked. The man seemed to consider it, but then he shook his head, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Nah, I don't think so. See, you've put us in a real tough spot here. Can't have you running off to the rangers telling them about our operation." It was then that I noticed the sweet, chemical smell in the air. With a sinking feeling, I realized what was going on. We'd stumbled onto a meth lab. "We won't say anything," Sarah said quickly. "We promise. We'll leave right now and forget we ever saw you." The man laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, you're not going anywhere. Boys, tie them up." The next few minutes were a blur of terror. We fought, of course, but we were outmatched. Soon, we found ourselves bound and gagged, thrown into the back of their truck. As they drove us deeper into the woods, I couldn't help but think about how badly we'd miscalculated. We'd wanted to get away from it all, but we'd never considered that it all might include the protection of civilization. They took us to a rundown cabin, the kind of place that wouldn't look out of place on the set of a horror movie. Inside, the chemical smell was overwhelming. Every surface was covered with the paraphernalia of their illegal operation. They tied us to chairs, removing our gags but warning us that if we screamed, things would get much worse for us. "Now," the leader said, pulling up a chair in front of us, "we need to figure out what to do with you two." Sarah and I exchanged terrified glances. I could see the same thought in her eyes that was running through my mind. We were going to die here. For hours, they debated our fate, ignoring our pleas and promises to keep quiet. As the night wore on, I began to lose hope. We were miles from anywhere. No one knew where we were, and we were at the mercy of men who clearly had no qualms about breaking the law. But then, just as dawn was breaking, we heard it. The distant thrum of helicopter blades. The men panicked, rushing to hide their equipment. In the chaos, Sarah managed to work one hand free from her bindings. With a strength born of desperation, she untied herself, then me. We ran, ignoring the shouts and curses behind us. We crashed through the underbrush, scratched and bleeding, driven by pure adrenaline and the will to survive. We emerged onto a logging road just as a police helicopter swooped overhead. Never in my life had I been so glad to see law enforcement. It turned out that the website we'd used to find our camping spot was actually a front for illegal activities. The coordinates were carefully chosen to lead unsuspecting campers into remote areas where criminal operations were taking place. The police had been monitoring it for months, and our check-in on the site had triggered their raid. In the days that followed, as we gave statements and identified suspects, the reality of what we'd been through began to sink in. We'd gone looking for solitude and found terror instead. It took a long time for either of us to feel comfortable in the outdoors again. Even now, years later, the sound of a truck engine on a quiet night can send my heart racing. But strangely, the experience brought Sarah and I closer than ever. We both quit our high-stress jobs, deciding that life was too short to spend it chasing promotions and billable hours. We started a non-profit organization dedicated to outdoor safety education, teaching people how to enjoy nature responsibly and safely. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself thinking about those men in the woods and how close we came to never making it out. But then I look at the life I've built since then, the people we've helped through our organization, and I realize something profound. We went into those woods looking for a way to escape our lives. Instead, we found a way to transform them. It wasn't the peaceful epiphany we'd been hoping for, far from it, but it was the wake-up call we needed. Now, when I stand at the edge of a forest, I feel a mix of emotions, residual fear, certainly, but also gratitude and purpose. Because I know that beyond those trees lies not just danger, but also possibility. And sometimes, it takes facing your worst fears to find your true path. The moment his friendly smile twisted into a menacing grin, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. My peaceful camping trip had just become a fight for survival. I'd been looking forward to this solo adventure for months. As a freelance graphic designer, I spent most of my days hunched over a computer, eyes strained from staring at screens. The idea of unplugging completely, of losing myself in the vast forests of Washington state, was irresistible. I'd chosen a spot well off the beaten path, a small clearing I'd found mentioned on an obscure camping forum. It promised complete solitude, far from the RV-filled campgrounds and chattering hikers. Just me, my van, and the wilderness. The drive out had been beautiful, winding roads taking me deeper into the forest. As the bars on my cell phone disappeared one by one, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. By the time I reached my destination, a sense of peace had settled over me. The clearing was perfect, a small, grassy area surrounded by towering pines. A babbling brook ran nearby, providing a soothing soundtrack. I parked my van, orienting it to catch the morning sun, and set about making camp. As evening fell, I sat outside my van, warming my hands on a mug of tea and watching the stars appear one by one. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt truly relaxed. I was just considering turning in for the night when I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. My heart rate picked up immediately. Who else could be out here? A figure emerged from the trees, and I tensed. But as he stepped into the clearing, I felt myself relax a little. He looked like a typical hiker, boots, cargo pants, flannel shirt. He carried a large backpack and used a walking stick to navigate the uneven ground. "Oh, hello there," he called out, his voice friendly. "I didn't expect to find anyone else out here." I stood up, brushing off my pants. "Hi," I replied, trying to keep the wariness out of my voice. "Yeah, it's pretty remote." He approached, and I could see he was older than I'd first thought, probably in his late 50s. He had a weathered face and a salt and pepper beard, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" he asked. "I've been hiking all day and could use a rest before I set up my own camp." Against my better judgment, I nodded. He seemed harmless enough, and part of me welcomed the company after a day of solitude. He introduced himself as Tom and settled down in the camp chair opposite mine. We chatted easily, exchanging the usual pleasantries. He told me he was an avid hiker, that he spent most of his free time exploring the wilderness. "There's something special about being out here, isn't there?" he said, gesturing at the forest around us, away from all the noise and chaos of the world. I nodded, feeling a kinship with this stranger who seemed to understand my need for escape. But as our conversation continued, I began to feel uneasy. Tom's questions were becoming more personal, more probing. He wanted to know where I was from, what I did for work, if I had family nearby. "I'm sorry," I said, cutting him off mid-question. "I don't mean to be rude, but I'm not really comfortable sharing so much personal information." For a split second, something dark flashed across Tom's face. But then his easy smile was back, and I wondered if I'd imagined it. Of course," he said smoothly. "I completely understand. Say, would you mind if I used your van to charge my phone? My battery died earlier today." Warning bells went off in my head. Why would he need to charge his phone out here, miles from any cell service? "I'm sorry," I said, standing up. "But I think it's time for me to turn in. It was nice meeting you, Tom." His smile faded, replaced by a look that sent chills down my spine. "Now, that's not very hospitable," he said, his voice low and menacing. "After I've come all this way to find you." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, find me?" He stood up slowly, and I took an involuntary step back. "You really should be more careful about what you post online," he said. "All those beautiful pictures of your van, the details about where you like to camp. It wasn't hard to track you down." Panic surged through me as I realized the terrible mistake I'd made. In my enthusiasm for van life and my travels, I'd shared far too much on social media, and now, miles from help, I was facing the consequences. I turned to run, but Tom was faster. He grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. Now, he said, his breath hot on my ear. "Let's not do anything rash." In that moment, survival instinct took over. I stomped hard on his foot and twisted out of his grasp. Without looking back, I ran for my van. I could hear Tom behind me, cursing and crashing through the underbrush. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, but finally, blessedly, the engine roared to life. As I peeled out of the clearing, I saw Tom in my rearview mirror. The friendly hiker was gone, replaced by something feral and angry. He hurled a rock at my van, and I heard it thunk against the side panel. I drove recklessly down the narrow forest road, branches scraping against the sides of my van. Every shadow looked like a threat, every bend in the road a potential ambush point. It wasn't until I reached the main highway that I allowed myself to breathe. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I realized I was crying. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached the nearest police station. The officers were kind but skeptical. Without any evidence beyond my word, there wasn't much they could do. In the days that followed, I scrubbed my social media accounts, deleting any information that could be used to track my movements. I installed new locks on my van and bought a personal alarm to carry with me. But the damage was done. My love for solo travel, for the peace and solitude of nature, had been tainted. Every cracking twig, every distant voice now sent my heart racing. It took months of therapy before I felt comfortable camping again, and even then, I stuck to crowded campgrounds with plenty of people around. The vast, empty wilderness that had once called to me now felt full of hidden dangers. Slowly, though, I began to reclaim my love for the outdoors. I joined hiking groups, made new friends who shared my passion for nature but understood my need for safety. I learned self-defense and wilderness survival skills, determined to never feel that vulnerable again. Now, years later, I still travel in my van, still seek out beautiful, remote places, but I do it with a new awareness, a hard-earned understanding of the darkness that can lurk in even the most beautiful settings. Sometimes late at night, I still see Tom's face in my dreams, his friendly smile morphing into that terrifying grin. But when I wake, instead of fear, I feel a sense of strength. I survived. I adapted. I refused to let one horrifying experience rob me of something I love. As I write this, I'm parked at the edge of a different forest, preparing for a new adventure. My van is now equipped with a state-of-the-art security system, and I have a satellite phone for emergencies. A group of fellow van lifers is meeting me here tomorrow for a week of hiking and exploration. The forest still calls to me, still offers the promise of peace and discovery. But now I enter it with open eyes, aware of both its beauty and its potential dangers. My experience taught me a harsh lesson about trust and safety, but it also showed me my own strength and resilience. The sun is setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. As I watch the light fade and the stars begin to appear, I feel a familiar sense of awe and contentment. The wilderness is still my happy place, my escape. It just took facing my worst fears to truly appreciate its power. The first beer bottle shattered against my van, and I knew this peaceful night under the Texas stars had just become a waking nightmare. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. As a freelance photographer based in Austin, my life was a constant whirlwind of deadlines, client meetings, and endless email chains. The idea of escaping to the hill country for a few days of solitude and stargazing was irresistible. I'd spent weeks researching the perfect spot, poring over maps and online forums. I wanted somewhere off the beaten path, far from the popular campgrounds and RV parks. Eventually, I found it, a small clearing on private land, where the owner allowed occasional campers for a modest fee. The drive out had been beautiful. As I left the city behind, the landscape opened up into rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and prickly pear cactus. The afternoon sun painted everything in warm, golden hues, and I felt the tension start to melt away from my shoulders. I arrived at the spot just as the sun was beginning to set. It was perfect, a flat area big enough for my van, with a stunning view of the valley below. I could already imagine the photos I'd take, the Milky Way stretching across the sky in all its glory. I set up camp quickly, years of practice making the process almost automatic. As darkness fell, I sat in my camp chair, nursing a cold beer and watching the stars come out one by one. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional distant call of a coyote. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt truly at peace. No cell signal meant no distractions, no urgent emails or text messages. Just me, the night sky, and the vast, quiet landscape of the hill country. I must have dozed off at some point, lulled by the cool night air and the absolute stillness. The sound of an engine jolted me awake. Blinking sleepily, I checked my watch. Just past midnight. Headlights appeared on the dirt road leading to my campsite, and my stomach tightened with apprehension. Who else would be out here at this hour? A pickup truck came into view, its engine roaring as it bounced over the uneven ground. Music blared from its speakers, shattering the peaceful silence of the night. As it got closer, I could make out several figures in the bed of the truck, whooping and hollering. The truck skidded to a stop just yards from my van, kicking up a cloud of dust. The music cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the truck doors opened, and 4 men piled out. Even in the dim starlight, I could tell they were trouble. They moved with the loose, aggressive swagger of the very drunk Tyrian beer bottles glinting in their hands. My heart started to race. I was alone, miles from help, faced with a group of intoxicated strangers who clearly didn't expect to find anyone else out here. Well, one of them called out, his voice slurred but menacing. What do we have here? I stood up slowly, trying to project a calm I definitely didn't feel. Evening, gentlemen, I said, keeping my voice steady. I'm just camping here for the night. Don't mean any trouble. They approached, spreading out in a loose semicircle around me. The one who had spoken seemed to be the leader. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a scruffy beard and eyes that glittered dangerously in the starlight. "This is our spot," he said, gesturing expansively with his beer bottle. "Has been for years. So what the hell are you doing here?" I swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. The landowner said it was okay for me to camp here. I can leave if—" "Landowner?" The man interrupted with a harsh laugh. "Old man Jenkins. He don't own shit. This is our land." The others muttered in agreement, moving in closer. I could smell the beer on their breath, see the way their eyes roved over my camping gear, my van. "Nice setup you got here," one of them said, running a hand along the side of my van. "Bet you got all sorts of fancy shit inside." I felt a surge of panic. These men weren't just drunk and territorial. They were looking to cause real trouble. My mind raced, trying to figure a way out of this situation. "Look," I said, fighting to keep my voice calm, "there's obviously been some kind of misunderstanding. Why don't I just pack up and go? No harm, no foul." The leader stepped forward, invading my personal space. He was so close I could see the stubble on his chin, smell the sour odor of too much cheap beer. "Oh, I don't think so," he said softly. "See, you've put us in an awkward position here. Can't have you running off to the cops, telling them about our little paradise." My blood ran cold. What had I stumbled into? Was this more than just a group of drunk locals looking for trouble? Before I could respond, one of the other men spoke up. "Hey, Daryl, check this out." He was peering through the window of my van. "This guy's got camera gear in here, expensive stuff." The leader, Daryl, grinned, and it was not a friendly expression. "Well now, ain't that interesting? Looks like we got ourselves a regular photographer. You spying on us, boy?" "No," I protested, panic rising in my throat. "I'm just here to take pictures of the stars. I swear, I didn't know anyone else would be out here." Daryl considered me for a long moment. His eyes narrowed. Then, without warning, he hurled his beer bottle at my van. It shattered against the side panel, making me jump. "Search him," Daryl ordered, and rough hands grabbed me before I could react. They went through my pockets, taking my wallet, keys, and phone. I stood there, heart pounding, as they rifled through my belongings. "Well, looky here," one of them said, holding up my phone. "No signal. Ain't that convenient?" Daryl nodded, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "All right, boys, let's show our guests some real Texas hospitality." What followed was a nightmare of violence and destruction. They ransacked my van, tearing through my carefully organized gear, smashing anything they couldn't steal. My cameras, lenses, laptop, all of it was either taken or destroyed. I didn't escape their wrath either. Fists and boots found me repeatedly, no matter how I tried to protect myself. Pain blossomed in my ribs, my face, my back. I tasted blood in my mouth and felt it trickle down my face from a cut above my eye. Through it all, I kept thinking, this can't be happening. This isn't real. But the pain was all too real, the laughter and jeers of my attackers cutting through the quiet night air. I'm not sure how long it went on. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each moment of violence feeling like an eternity. But finally, mercifully, they tired of their sport. "All right, that's enough," Daryl said, breathing heavily. "Let's get out of here." They piled back into their truck, my precious gear loaded in the bed. As they prepared to leave, Daryl turned back to me, sprawled on the ground and barely conscious. "Don't come back here," he said, his voice cold. "And don't even think about going to the cops. We know who you are now. We'll find you." The truck roared to life, and they peeled out, leaving me alone in the destroyed remnants of my campsite. I don't know how long I lay there, every breath sending shards of pain through my battered body. But eventually, I managed to drag myself into my van. It was a mess, drawers pulled out, belongings strewn everywhere. But the engine still worked, and that was all that mattered. I drove through the night, paranoia making me jump at every shadow. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest hospital, where I finally allowed myself to break down as the doctors tended to my injuries. The police were sympathetic but not optimistic. Without any real evidence or witnesses, it was my word against the wind. They took my statement, promised to look into it, but I could see in their eyes that they didn't expect much to come of it. In the weeks that followed, as I healed physically, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The financial loss was significant. My insurance didn't cover theft, and replacing all my gear would take months of saving. The moment I saw the glint of metal in his hand, I realized our peaceful camping trip had just become a life-or-death situation. My best friend Jake and I had been planning this trip for months. Both of us were burnt out from our jobs in Miami, me as a software developer, him as a high school teacher. We needed an escape, a chance to disconnect from the world and recharge our batteries. We'd chosen the Everglades for our getaway, drawn by the promise of unparalleled biodiversity and complete isolation. Jake had found a website that listed GPS coordinates for remote camping spots, far off the beaten path. It seemed perfect, a way to truly get away from it all and experience the raw beauty of nature. We set out early on a Saturday morning, my old Jeep packed to the brim with camping gear and enough food to last us a week. The drive was beautiful, the landscape gradually transforming from urban sprawl to lush wetlands. As civilization faded away in the rear-view mirror, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. By mid-afternoon, we'd reached the turnoff for our chosen spot. The narrow dirt road was barely more than a trail, winding through dense mangrove forests and sawgrass marshes. The Jeep bounced and jolted as we navigated the uneven terrain, but the sense of adventure more than made up for the discomfort. "This is insane," Jake laughed, gripping the dashboard as we lurched over another bump. "I can't believe we're actually doing this." I grinned, feeling more alive than I had in months. "I know, it's perfect, right?" We found our spot just as the sun was starting to dip towards the horizon. It was a small clearing on a slightly elevated piece of ground, surrounded by towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. A small creek gurgled nearby, its surface occasionally broken by the ripples of unseen creatures. We set up camp efficiently, working together to pitch the tent and gather firewood. As darkness fell, we sat by our campfire, cold beers in hand, marveling at the symphony of sounds around us. Frogs croaked, insects chirped, and somewhere in the distance, an alligator bellowed. "We should do this more often," Jake said, leaning back in his camp chair with a contented sigh. I'd forgotten how good it feels to just exist in nature. I nodded, feeling the same sense of peace. Agreed. Maybe we need to reevaluate our life choices when we get back. We stayed up late, swapping stories and pointing out constellations in the impossibly clear night sky. When we finally crawled into our tent, I fell asleep almost instantly, lulled by the gentle sounds of the swamp. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up. Something had pulled me from sleep, some instinct warning me that something wasn't right. I lay still for a moment, listening intently. Then I heard it, the soft splash of a paddle in water, barely audible over the nighttime chorus of the Everglades. I sat up, my heart starting to race. "Jake," I whispered, shaking him awake. "There's someone out there." He blinked at me groggily. "What? That's impossible. We're miles from anywhere." But then he heard it too, another splash, closer this time, followed by the subtle scrape of a boat against the shore. We scrambled out of the tent, fear making us clumsy. In the pale moonlight, I could see a small boat tied to a cypress knee at the edge of our clearing. A figure was climbing out, his movements slow and deliberate. Jake and I exchanged a panicked glance. This wasn't how this trip was supposed to go. "Hey!" the figure called out, his voice surprisingly calm. "You boys picked a hell of a spot for camping." As he approached, I could make out more details. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with weathered skin and sharp, alert eyes. He wore camo pants and a sweat-stained t-shirt, and there was something in his hand that caught the moonlight, a large hunting knife. My mouth went dry. "We're sorry," I managed to say, my voice shaking slightly. "We didn't realize this area was off limits." The man chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "Oh, it ain't off limits. It's just occupied." He was close enough now that I could smell him, a mixture of sweat, river water, and something chemical that I couldn't quite place. "Look," Jake said, always the diplomat. "We don't want any trouble. We can pack up and leave right now if we're intruding." The man's eyes narrowed, studying us intently. "Afraid it ain't that simple, boys. You see, you've wandered into something you shouldn't have." It was then that I noticed the bags in his boat, dozens of them, all identical, all filled with something that definitely wasn't camping gear. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We'd stumbled onto a smuggling operation. The man must have seen the understanding dawn on our faces. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Well, shit. This complicates things." Jake and I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Run, fight, try to reason with him. Every option seemed equally impossible. "Here's the situation," the man said, his voice taking on a businesslike tone. "I've got a shipment to move, and I can't have you two interfering. So we've got two options here." He paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. "Option one," he continued. "You boys help me load these bags into my truck about a mile from here. Then you get in your Jeep and drive away. You forget you ever saw me or this place. That's the easy way." The implied threat of option two hung heavy in the air. Jake and I exchanged glances. The smart move would be to agree, to do what he said and get out of there as fast as possible. But something in me rebelled at the thought of being party to whatever illegal operation this was. "And if we refuse?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. The man's expression hardened. "Then we've got a problem, and I've got a lot of experience solving problems out here in the glades." He took a step forward, the knife in his hand suddenly very prominent. "So what's it gonna be, boys?" Time seemed to slow down. I could see every detail with crystal clarity. The beads of sweat on the man's forehead, the slight tremor in Jake's hands, the way the moonlight glinted off the blade of the knife. In that moment, I made a decision. It wasn't brave or noble. It was pure survival instinct. I lunged forward, catching the man off guard. My shoulder connected with his midsection, driving the air from his lungs. We went down in a tangle of limbs, grappling in the dirt. "Run!" I yelled to Jake. "Get to the Jeep!" The man was strong, fueled by desperation and who knows what else. His fist connected with my jaw, sending stars exploding across my vision. But adrenaline was coursing through my veins, lending me strength I didn't know I had. I managed to pin his knife hand to the ground, my other hand scrabbling in the dirt for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a hefty branch, and I swung it without thinking. There was a sickening crack, and the man went limp beneath me. For a moment, I just sat there, panting, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then Jake was there, pulling me to my feet. "We have to go," he said urgently. "Now." We grabbed what we could from our campsite, leaving the tent and most of our gear behind. The Jeep roared to life, and we tore down the rough trail, branches whipping against the windshield. As we reached the main road, the first hints of dawn were starting to lighten the eastern sky. We drove in silence, both of us too shaken to speak. It wasn't until we reached the outskirts of Miami that Jake finally broke the silence. "What do we do now?" I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. "We go to the police, tell them everything." The next few days were a blur of police statements, park ranger interviews, and sleepless nights. They found our campsite, and the man, who turned out to be a key player in a large drug smuggling operation. But the memory of that night stayed with us, a constant reminder of how quickly a peaceful escape can turn into a nightmare. We never went camping in the Everglades again, but strangely, the experience brought Jake and I closer than ever. We both left our jobs, deciding that life was too short to spend it stressed and unfulfilled. We started an outdoor education program for at-risk youth, using our story, slightly edited, to teach kids about the importance of safety and preparation in the wilderness. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself thinking about that man in the glades and how close we came to a very different ending. But then I look at the lives we've impacted through our program, the kids we've helped steer towards a better path, and I realize something profound. We went into those swamps looking for a way to escape our lives. Instead, we found a way to transform them. It wasn't the peaceful epiphany we'd been hoping for, far from it, but it was the wake-up call we needed. Now, when I stand at the edge of a wild place, I feel a mix of emotions. Residual fear, certainly, but also gratitude and purpose. Because I know that beyond those trees or swamps lies not just danger, but also possibility. And sometimes, it takes facing your worst fears to find your true calling. The moment he said that I'm a fugitive, I knew my peaceful night in the forest had just become a waking nightmare. I'd been looking forward to this solo camping trip for months. As a high-powered corporate lawyer in Seattle, my life was a constant whirlwind of meetings, briefs, and late nights at the office. The idea of escaping to the solitude of the forest, even for just a weekend, was intoxicating. I'd chosen a remote spot in the Cascade Mountains, far from the popular campgrounds and hiking trails. It was the kind of place you had to really want to find, which suited me perfectly. I needed isolation, a chance to clear my head and reassess my life choices. The drive up had been beautiful, the urban sprawl giving way to towering pines and snow-capped peaks. As I navigated my camper van along increasingly narrow and winding roads, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. I arrived at my chosen spot just as the sun was beginning to set. It was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by ancient trees with a bubbling stream nearby. I could already feel the stress of the city melting away. I set up camp efficiently, years of practice making the process almost automatic. As darkness fell, I sat outside my van, nursing a glass of wine and watching the stars appear one by one. The only sounds were the gentle rustle of wind through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt truly at peace. No phone signal meant no emails, no urgent texts from clients or colleagues. Just me, the night sky, and the vast, quiet expanse of the forest. I must have dozed off at some point, lulled by the cool mountain air and the absolute stillness. A sound jolted me awake, a crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. I blinked, disoriented, and checked my watch. Just past midnight. That's when I saw him, a figure emerging from the shadows of the trees. My heart leapt into my throat. Who else could possibly be out here at this hour? As he approached, I could make out more details. He was a man, probably in his 30s, gone with wild, unkempt hair and several days' worth of stubble on his face. His clothes were dirty and torn, and there was a frantic look in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse and desperate. "I need help." I stood slowly, my mind racing. Every instinct told me to get in my van and drive away as fast as I could. But something in his tone, the raw desperation in his eyes, made me hesitate. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Not hurt, but in trouble. Big trouble." He took a deep breath, then met my eyes. "I'm a fugitive. The cops are after me." In that moment, it felt like the bottom dropped out of my world. Here I was, miles from anywhere, face to face with a man on the run from the law. Every true crime podcast I'd ever listened to flashed through my mind. "I haven't done anything wrong," he rushed to add, seeing the fear on my face. "I swear, I was framed." But they won't believe me. I had to run. Part of me wanted to tell him to leave, to threaten to call the police. But we both knew that was an empty threat out here, with no cell service for miles. And a larger part of me, the part that had become a lawyer to fight for justice, couldn't help but be intrigued. "Okay," I said slowly. "Why don't you sit down and tell me what happened?" He sank gratefully onto the ground, exhaustion evident in every line of his body, and then he started to talk. His name was Mike, and he'd been an accountant at a mid-sized tech company in Portland. 6 months ago, he'd noticed some discrepancies in the company's financial records, signs of embezzlement on a massive scale. When he'd brought his concerns to his superiors, he'd been assured they would look into it, but nothing happened. The discrepancies continued, growing larger each month. Mike had kept digging, gathering evidence, building a case. And then, just as he was preparing to go to the authorities, everything had gone sideways. "I came home one night to find my apartment ransacked," he said, his voice shaking at the memory. "My laptop with all the evidence was gone, and there was blood, so much blood." He'd panicked and run, only to hear on the news the next day that he was wanted for murder. The body of his boss had been found in his apartment, and all signs pointed to Mike as the killer. "But I didn't do it," he insisted, his eyes pleading for me to believe him. "I was set up. They're trying to silence me before I can expose their scheme." As he talked, I found myself believing him. Maybe it was the earnestness in his voice, or the detailed nature of his story. Or maybe it was just that I wanted to believe that the world wasn't as corrupt as my years as a lawyer had led me to think. "What are you going to do?" I asked when he'd finished. He ran a hand through his tangled hair, looking lost. "I don't know. I've been running for weeks, so I'm staying off the grid. But I'm running out of options. I need to clear my name, but I don't know how." I took a deep breath, knowing I was about to make a decision that could change both our lives forever. "I might be able to help. I'm a lawyer." The hope that bloomed on his face was almost painful to see. "Really? You believe me?" I nodded slowly. "I think I do. But we need to be smart about this. If what you're saying is true, these people are dangerous and well-connected." We spent the rest of the night planning. I couldn't take him back to Seattle with me. That would be too risky. But I had a colleague in Portland, someone I trusted implicitly, who might be willing to take on his case. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, we had the outline of a plan. Mike would stay hidden in the mountains while I returned to the city. I would reach out to my colleague, present Mike's case, and start building a defense. It was risky. If I was wrong about Mike, if he really was guilty, I could be throwing away my entire career. But if he was telling the truth, this could be the most important case of my life. Just as we were preparing to part ways, we heard it, the distant thrum of helicopter blades. Mike's face went pale. "They've found me," he whispered, panic evident in his voice. I made a split-second decision. "Get in the van," I said, already moving towards the driver's seat. "Now!" We threw my camping gear in haphazardly and took off down the mountain road, the sound of the helicopter growing louder behind us. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I drove like I'd never driven before, taking turns too fast, bouncing over ruts in the road. Mike clung to his seat, his knuckles white. The helicopter sound faded and then grew louder again as they tried to track our movements through the dense forest. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we hit the main road. I floored it, heading east instead of west, away from Seattle. It wasn't until we'd been driving for an hour, the helicopter long since left behind, that I allowed myself to relax slightly. "What now?" Mike asked, his voice small and scared. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing. "Now we fight. We're going to clear your name and expose the real criminals." As we drove into the rising sun, I felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. I'd gone into those woods seeking peace and clarity. Instead, I'd found a mission, a cause worth fighting for. I didn't know what the coming days and weeks would bring, I didn't know if we'd succeed or if we were driving towards our doom. But I did know one thing. My life would never be the same again. The peaceful solitude I'd sought had led me to this moment, this choice, and as terrifying as it was, I couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly where I was meant to be. The moment I felt the hand clamp over my mouth, I knew my peaceful desert getaway had become a fight for survival. I'd been dreaming of this solo trip to the New Mexico desert for months. As a burnt-out ER nurse from Chicago, I desperately needed an escape from the constant beeping of machines, the frantic pace, and the weight of life and death decisions. The idea of vast, empty spaces and star-filled skies called to me like a siren song. I'd chosen a spot deep in the desert, far from any marked campgrounds or tourist trails. It was the kind of place you had to really want to find, which suited me perfectly. I needed isolation, a chance to hear myself think for the first time in years. The drive out had been cathartic, watching the landscape transform from urban sprawl to scrubby flatlands, and finally to the otherworldly beauty of the desert. As I navigated my camper van along increasingly rough and unmarked roads, I felt the knot of stress in my chest begin to loosen. I arrived at my chosen spot just as the sun was sinking towards the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of orange and pink. It was perfect. A small plateau overlooking a vast expanse of sand and rock formations. I could already feel the chaos of my everyday life fading away. I set up camp efficiently, the process almost meditative. As darkness fell, I sat outside my van, nursing a beer and watching in awe as the stars emerged, more than I'd ever seen in my light-polluted city life. The only sounds were the gentle whisper of the wind and the occasional cry of a distant coyote. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt truly at peace. No phone signal meant no calls from the hospital, no texts asking me to cover extra shifts. Just me, the night sky, and the vast, silent expanse of the desert. I must have dozed off at some point, lulled by the cool night air and the absolute stillness. A sound jolted me awake, the crunch of footsteps on sand. I blinked, disoriented, and checked my watch. Just past midnight. That's when I saw them. Dark figures emerging from the shadows, moving with purposeful stealth towards my van. My heart leapt into my throat. Who could possibly be out here at this hour? I didn't have time to react. Before I could even think about running, strong hands grabbed me from behind. One clamped over my mouth, stifling my instinctive scream, while another pinned my arms to my sides. "Don't move," a gruff voice whispered in my ear. "Don't make a sound." I froze, terror coursing through my veins. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not in this empty expanse of desert where I'd come to find peace. More figures approached, their features indistinct in the pale moonlight. There were at least 5 of them, all men, all moving with a quiet efficiency that spoke of practice and coordination. "What do we do with her?" one of them asked, gesturing towards me. The one holding me, clearly the leader, was silent for a moment. I could feel the tension in his body, the slight tremor in the hand over my mouth that belied his calm exterior. "We take her with us," he finally said. "We can't leave witnesses." My mind reeled. Witnesses to what? What had I stumbled into out here in the middle of nowhere? They dragged me towards a group of vehicles I hadn't noticed before. Rugged off-road trucks parked in the shadow of a large rock formation. I was bundled into the back of one, my hands quickly and efficiently tied behind my back. As we drove off into the night, bouncing over the rough terrain, I tried to make sense of what was happening. Were they smugglers? Kidnappers? My imagination ran wild with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. We drove for what felt like hours, deeper into the desert. I lost all sense of direction, each sand dune and rock formation looking the same in the darkness. Finally, we came to a stop in a small canyon, the high walls providing natural cover. They pulled me out of the truck, my legs wobbly from the long ride and from fear. That's when I saw it, a small plane. its matte black paint making it almost invisible against the night sky. "Get it loaded," the leader barked. "We're behind schedule." The men moved quickly, transferring large duffel bags from the trucks to the plane. Even in my terrified state, I couldn't help but notice the practiced efficiency of their movements. This was clearly not their first rodeo. As they worked, I managed to get my first good look at my captors. They were a diverse group, different ages, races, builds, but they all shared a hard, watchful look in their eyes. These were dangerous men, used to operating outside the law. The leader approached me, his face thrown into sharp relief by the headlights of one of the trucks. He was older than I'd expected, with graying hair and deep lines etched into his weathered face. His eyes, when they met mine, were cold and assessing. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry with fear. "Sarah," I managed to croak out. He nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "Well, Sarah, you've put us in quite a predicament. We can't have you running off to the authorities, telling them what you've seen." I found my voice, desperation lending me courage. "I haven't seen anything. I don't know who you are or what you're doing. I'm just a nurse from Chicago on vacation. Please, just let me go. I swear I won't say anything." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I wish it were that simple, Sarah. I really do." One of the other men approached, speaking in a low voice. "We're loaded and ready to go, boss." The leader nodded, then turned back to me. "Looks like you're coming with us for a little ride, Sarah. Don't worry, we're not going to hurt you, not if we don't have to." The implied threat in those last words sent a chill down my spine. They led me to the plane, helping me climb aboard with my hands still tied behind my back. The interior was stripped down, clearly modified for their illicit purposes. I was secured to a seat near the back, surrounded by the mysterious duffel bags. As the engines roared to life, I felt a surge of panic. This was really happening. I was being kidnapped, flown to God knows where by a group of criminals. How had my peaceful desert retreat gone so horribly wrong? We took off, the small plane bouncing in the turbulent air. Through the window, I watched the desert fall away beneath us, the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky. I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion and stress finally overwhelming me. I woke to the sensation of descending, the plane banking sharply. Out the window, I could see we were approaching a small, unmarked airstrip in the middle of dense forest. We were a long way from the desert. As we taxied to a stop, the leader came to untie me. "We're going to let you go," he said, his voice low and serious. "But you need to understand something. We know who you are, Sarah. We know where you live, where you work. If you ever breathe a word of what you've seen to anyone, we'll know, and we'll find you. Do you understand?" I nodded, too scared and relieved to speak. They left me there on that remote airstrip, the sound of the plane's engines fading into the distance as they took off again. I stood there for a long time, shaking, trying to process what had happened. It took me 2 days to find my way back to civilization, hitchhiking and walking through unfamiliar countryside. When I finally made it to a small town and called the police, I told them I'd gotten lost hiking. The truth seemed too unbelievable, too dangerous to share. I never went back to my job in Chicago. How could I? Knowing what I knew, knowing that they knew who I was. Instead, I moved to a small town in Montana, taking a job at a quiet rural clinic. I changed my name, my appearance, my whole life. But I never forgot that night in the desert. Sometimes, when I look up at the stars, I'm transported back to that moment of perfect peace before everything went wrong. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I imagine I hear the distant hum of a plane engine coming to find me. My quest for solitude had led me into darkness I never could have imagined. And while I'd found my way back to the light, I knew I'd never be the same again. The vast, empty spaces that had once called to me now felt full of hidden dangers, reminding me that sometimes the most perilous wilderness is the one we carry within ourselves. The moment I realized Paul was missing, I knew our romantic getaway had turned into something far more sinister. We'd been looking forward to this cabin trip for months. Our relationship had been strained lately, the pressures of our high-stress jobs in New York City taking their toll. Paul Lee, a hotshot investment banker, and I, a corporate lawyer, barely had time to see each other, let alone nurture our relationship. This weekend was supposed to change all that. We'd found the perfect spot, a secluded cabin nestled deep in the Adirondacks, miles from the nearest neighbor. As we drove up the winding mountain road, the tension between us was palpable. We'd had another argument about Paul's long hours and my constant work calls, but I was determined to make this weekend work. We needed this. The cabin was everything the listing had promised, rustic yet comfortable, with a large stone fireplace and panoramic views of the forest. As we unpacked, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was exactly what we needed to reconnect. That first evening started well enough. We opened a bottle of wine and sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. For a while, it felt like old times, just Paul and me, talking and laughing without the constant interruption of emails and phone calls. But as night fell, the old tensions resurfaced. Paul made a comment about my obsession with work, and I fired back about his late nights at the office. Before I knew it, we were in a full-blown argument, voices rising to echo through the quiet forest. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah," Paul finally said, his voice tired and defeated. "I need some air." He grabbed his jacket and stormed out, the cabin door slamming behind him. I watched from the window as he disappeared into the darkening woods, anger and frustration warring with worry in my chest. I told myself he just needed to cool off. Paul had always been one to walk away from confrontation, to need space to process his emotions. I busied myself with cleaning up our half-eaten dinner, trying to ignore the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. 1 hour passed, then 2. The woods outside had grown pitch black, and a light rain had started to fall. Paul still hadn't returned. By midnight, I was frantic. This wasn't like him to stay out so long, especially in unfamiliar territory. I grabbed a flashlight and my rain jacket, steeling myself to go look for him. The moment I stepped outside, the enormity of the task hit me. The forest was vast and dark, the trees looming ominously in the weak beam of my flashlight. The rain had picked up, making the ground slick and treacherous. "Hi, Paul!" I called, my voice sounding small and insignificant against the backdrop of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. "Paul, where are you?" I walked for what felt like hours, my clothes soaked through, mud caking my boots. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the eerie quiet of the forest. But there was no sign of Paul. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I made my way back to the cabin, exhausted and terrified. I had to call for help. This was beyond my capabilities. But when I tried to use my cell phone, there was no signal. The landline in the cabin was dead too. We were completely cut off. Panic started to set in. What if Paul was hurt? What if he'd fallen in the dark, unable to call for help? Or what if... No, I couldn't let myself think about the other possibilities. I forced myself to be methodical, to think like the lawyer I was. I searched the cabin for any clue as to where Paul might have gone. That's when I noticed it. His wallet and keys were still on the bedside table. Wherever he was, he hadn't planned to go far. As I picked up his wallet, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. I unfolded it with trembling hands. It was a note. hastily scribbled in Paul's handwriting. "If anything happens to me, look in the old well behind the cabin." My blood ran cold. What did he mean? If anything happens. What did Paul know that I didn't? With growing dread, I made my way to the back of the cabin. Sure enough, there was an old, abandoned well, its stones covered in moss and ivy. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it over the gentle patter of rain. Peering down into the darkness, I called out, "Paul, are you down there?" No response, just the echo of my own voice and the drip of water. I noticed something reflecting the weak morning light at the bottom of the well. Squinting, I could just make out what looked like a metal box. My mind raced. Should I try to retrieve it? What if it was a clue to Paul's disappearance? But what if this was some kind of trap? In the end, curiosity and desperation won out. I found some rope in a shed near the cabin and, with shaking hands, managed to lower myself into the well. The metal box was heavier than I expected, and it took all my strength to haul it up and out. Back in the cabin, I pried open the rusted lid. Inside was a stack of documents, financial records, emails, photographs. As I sifted through them, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Paul hadn't been working late at the office all those nights. He'd been investigating his firm, uncovering a massive fraud scheme that implicated some of the most powerful people on Wall Street. The documents in the box were his evidence, carefully gathered over months. Suddenly, his paranoia over the past few weeks made sense. The hushed phone calls, the furtive glances over his shoulder. He must have hidden this box here on a previous visit. Insurance against... what? A chill ran down my spine as I realized the true implications of what I was holding. If Paul had disappeared because of this, then I was now in danger too. Just then, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside. My heart leapt. Was it Paul? But as I peered out the window, I saw an unfamiliar black SUV pulling up. Two men in suits got out, their expressions grim and purposeful. I knew in that moment that they weren't here to help. Grabbing the box, I slipped out the back door of the cabin. My mind was reeling, torn between the need to find Paul and the instinct to run. As I plunged into the woods, I could hear shouts behind me. They'd discovered I was gone. The chase was on. I ran blindly, the box clutched to my chest, branches whipping at my face. I had no plan, no destination in mind. All I knew was that I had to get away, to keep this evidence safe. It was the key to finding Paul, to understanding what had happened. Hours passed in a blur of fear and adrenaline. I could hear my pursuers in the distance, getting closer, then fading away again. As night fell, I found myself at the edge of a steep ravine. I was exhausted, hungry, and lost. Curling up in the hollow of a large tree, I allowed myself a moment to break down. How had this happened? How had our romantic getaway turned into this nightmare? But as I sat there, clutching the box that held the key to this mystery, I felt a resolve harden within me. I was going to find Paul. I was going to uncover the truth behind his disappearance, and I was going to make sure that whoever was responsible paid for what they'd done. Our peaceful cabin in the woods had become the starting point of a dangerous journey, but I was no longer the same person who had arrived here full of hope for a quiet weekend. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder, more determined. As I heard the distant shouts of my pursuers, I stood up, my muscles protesting but my will ironclad. I had to keep moving. For Paul, for the truth, for justice. The woods that had once seemed so peaceful now felt alive with hidden threats. But I was no longer afraid, I was angry, and I was going to find answers, no matter where this dark path led me. Our romantic getaway had turned into a nightmare, but it had also awakened something in me, a strength I didn't know I possessed, and I would need every ounce of that strength for what lay ahead. The moment I saw Kevin's eyes, I knew our reunion had become a death trap. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion, 5 friends, reuniting after years apart, spending a weekend in a cozy cabin nestled in the woods. We'd all been excited when Tom suggested it, eager to escape our busy lives and reconnect. As I drove up the winding mountain road, memories flooded back. The 5 of us, me, Tom, Sarah, Dan, and Kevin, had been inseparable in college. But life, as it often does, had pulled us in different directions. This weekend was our chance to recapture that old magic. The cabin was everything Tom had promised, rustic yet comfortable, with a large stone fireplace and a wraparound porch offering breathtaking views of the surrounding forest. As I pulled up, I saw Tom's car already parked outside. "Alex," he called, emerging from the cabin with a broad grin. "You made it." We hugged, and for a moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. Tom looked good, a little grayer at the temples, but still with that boyish enthusiasm I remembered. "Sarah and Dan are already inside," he said, helping me with my bag. "We're just waiting on Kevin." Inside, the reunion continued. Sarah, now a successful architect, greeted me with a warm hug. Dan, who'd become a high school teacher, clapped me on the back. We fell into easy conversation, catching up on years of missed moments. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, we heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Kevin had arrived. There was a moment of awkward silence as he walked in. Kevin had always been the wild card of our group, brilliant but unpredictable. He'd dropped out of college in our senior year, and we'd heard rumors of mental health struggles since then. But he seemed okay as he greeted us. If a little subdued, we all chose to focus on the positive, on the joy of being together again. That first evening was magical. We opened bottles of wine, cooked dinner together, and sat around the fireplace sharing stories of our lives. It felt like old times, the years and distances melting away. It wasn't until late in the night, as the wine flowed freely and inhibitions lowered, that the first cracks began to show. Kevin, who'd been quiet most of the evening, suddenly spoke up. "Remember that night in senior year? The bonfire party?" We all nodded, exchanging glances. It had been a legendary night, one of our last big blowouts before graduation. "You all left me there," Kevin said, his voice low and intense. "I passed out, and you just left me." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. I remembered that night differently. We'd looked for Kevin, couldn't find him, assumed he'd gone home with someone. "Come on, Kev," Tom said, trying to lighten the mood. That was years ago. We were all pretty wasted that night. But Kevin wasn't letting it go. "That was the beginning," he muttered. "The start of everything falling apart." The mood had shifted, tension crackling in the air. We all made excuses to turn in early, hoping a good night's sleep would reset things. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of hushed voices. Creeping to my door, I could hear Kevin and Tom arguing in low, intense tones. "You don't understand," Kevin was saying. "None of you do, but you will." I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, things seemed better. Kevin was quieter, but not hostile. We decided to go for a hike, hoping the fresh air and exercise would clear the air. The forest was beautiful, sunlight filtering through the canopy, birds singing in the distance. For a while, it felt like we'd recaptured the easy camaraderie of our college days. But as we reached a scenic overlook, Kevin stopped abruptly. "I think it's time we talked about why we're really here," he said. We all turned to look at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "We're here to catch up, to reconnect." Kevin laughed, but there was no humor in it. "No," he said. "We're here so I can finally get what I deserve." That's when I saw it, the glint of metal in his hand. A gun. "Kevin," Dan said, his voice calm but tense. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done years ago," Kevin replied, "making things right." The next few moments were a blur. Kevin, waving the gun, herding us back towards the cabin. The 5 of us, Once the best of friends, now captor and captives. Back at the cabin, Kevin ordered us to sit on the floor of the living room. His eyes were wild, darting from person to person. I could see the others were as terrified as I was. "You all think you're so successful, so happy," Kevin spat. "But you built your lives on my broken dreams. You left me behind, forgot about me. Well, now you're going to pay." "Kevin, please," Sarah pleaded. "Whatever you think we did, we can talk about this. We can make it right." But Kevin wasn't listening. He paced back and forth, the gun wavering in his unsteady hand. "Do you know what happened to me after college?" he asked. "Do you even care?" None of us spoke. We were all too afraid of saying the wrong thing, of setting him off. "I tried to kill myself," Kevin continued, his voice breaking. "Twice. While you were all out there living your perfect lives, I was in and out of hospitals, trying to piece myself back together. My heart ached for him. How had we not known? How had we let our friend suffer alone?" "We're sorry, Kevin," I said softly. "We didn't know, but this isn't the way to handle it. Please, put the gun down. Let's talk about this." For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the old Kevin in his eyes, but then it was gone, replaced by that manic gleam. "Talk?" He laughed bitterly. "Oh, we're going to do more than talk. We're going to play a game of truth and consequences." Over the next few hours, Kevin forced us to confess our darkest secrets, our betrayals and lies. With each revelation, the tension in the room grew. Old wounds were reopened, friendships tested. I learned things about my friends I never knew, never wanted to know. Tom's business success was built on insider trading. Sarah had had an affair with Dan, betraying her husband and Dan's wife. And me. I had to admit to the role I played in Kevin's downfall, the times I'd ignored his cries for help, too wrapped up in my own life to see his pain. As night fell, we were all emotionally exhausted, raw from the forced confessions. Kevin seemed to be losing steam, the manic energy that had driven him starting to fade. That's when Tom made his move. In a burst of desperate courage, he lunged at Kevin, trying to wrestle the gun away. The rest of us jumped up, ready to help. But in the struggle, the gun went off. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then Tom collapsed, blood blossoming on his shirt. "No!" Sarah screamed, rushing to Tom's side. Dan and I stood frozen, torn between helping Tom and subduing Kevin. Kevin stared at the gun in his hand, then at Tom's still form. The wild look in his eyes was gone, replaced by shock and horror. I didn't mean to," he stammered. In that moment of his distraction, I made my decision. I tackled Kevin, knocking the gun from his hand. Dan was right behind me, helping to subdue our former friend. The next few hours were a blur. Somehow, we managed to get help. Tom was rushed to the hospital. He would survive, but barely. Kevin was arrested, his face blank with shock as the police led him away. As I sat in the hospital waiting room, surrounded by the shattered remains of our friend group, I couldn't help but think about how it had all gone so wrong. We'd come to this cabin hoping to reconnect, to recapture the magic of our youth. Instead, we'd unearthed long-buried resentments and secrets that had nearly destroyed us all. In the days and weeks that followed, we all had to come to terms with our role in what happened. We'd all failed Kevin in some way, too caught up in our own lives to see his struggle. And in ignoring his pain, we'd allowed it to fester and grow into something dangerous. Our idyllic reunion had turned into a nightmare, forcing us to confront the darker sides of ourselves and each other. The bonds we thought were unbreakable had been tested, some broken beyond repair. As I left the hospital, the weight of all that had happened heavy on my shoulders, I realized that sometimes the past is better left in the past, and that true friendship isn't about reliving old glories, but about being there for each other in the present, no matter how difficult that might be. Our cabin in the woods had become a crucible, burning away our illusions and leaving behind hard truths. We'd gone there seeking nostalgia and found a reckoning instead. And while the scars of that weekend would never fully heal, they would serve as a constant reminder of the price of neglect and the true meaning of friendship. The moment I saw Derek's car in the driveway, I knew my peaceful retreat had become a dangerous game of cat and mouse. I had chosen this remote cabin in the woods as my sanctuary, a place to heal and find myself again after our tumultuous breakup. Derek and I had been together for 5 years, a relationship that had slowly morphed from passionate love to something darker, more controlling. When I finally found the strength to leave, it felt like emerging from a long, suffocating tunnel into the light. The cabin belonged to my aunt, a quirky artist who spent most of her time traveling. She had offered it to me without hesitation when I called, desperate for a place to escape. "It's peaceful there," she had said. "A good place to find yourself again." And it had been, for the first few days. I had arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, the trees a riot of red and gold. The cabin was small but cozy, with a wraparound porch and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. I spent my days hiking in the surrounding woods, reading books I had neglected for years, and rediscovering the simple joy of solitude. But now, as I stood frozen in the kitchen, coffee mug halfway to my lips, all that peace shattered at the sight of Derek's sleek black Audi parked next to my beat-up Subaru. How had he found me? I had been so careful, telling only my closest friends and family where I was going. My heart raced as I set down the mug with trembling hands. Should I run? Hide? Confront him? Before I could decide, there was a knock at the door. Gentle, almost hesitant. Not at all like the angry pounding I had feared. "Emily?" Derek's voice, softer than I remembered. "I know you're in there. Please, can we talk?" I closed my eyes, took a deep breath. Part of me, the part that still ached for the good times we had shared, wanted to open the door. But the stronger part, the part that remembered the arguments, the subtle manipulation, the feeling of slowly losing myself, kept me rooted in place. "Go away, Derek," I called out, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "I don't want to see you." A pause. Then, "I'm not leaving until we talk. I'll wait out here all day if I have to." I knew he meant it. Derek had always been persistent, a trait I once admired, but now feared. I glanced at my phone on the counter, considering calling the police, but what would I say? My ex-boyfriend showed up uninvited. He hadn't done anything threatening, yet. Hours passed. I paced the cabin, alternating between peeking out the windows and straining to hear any sound from outside. Derek remained in his car, occasionally getting out to stretch his legs or smoke a cigarette. Each time he did, I tensed, expecting him to try breaking in. But he never did. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, I heard his car door open again. This time, instead of his usual circuit around the car, his footsteps crunched towards the cabin. My pulse quickened. "Emily," he called out, closer now. He must be on the porch. "Please, I know I messed up. I've changed. I've been seeing a therapist, working on my issues. Just give me a chance to explain." His voice cracked on the last word, and despite everything, I felt a pang in my chest. I remembered the Derek I had fallen in love with, charming, funny, ambitious. When had things gone so wrong? Against my better judgment, I found myself moving towards the door. My hand hovered over the knob as I wrestled with indecision. 5 minutes, I said finally, hating how weak I sounded. "You have 5 minutes to say what you need to say, then you leave." I opened the door a crack, chain still in place. Derek stood there, looking more disheveled than I had ever seen him. His usually immaculate hair was mussed, dark circles under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. "Thank you," he breathed, relief evident in his voice. "Can I come in?" I shook my head. "Say what you need to say from there." He nodded, accepting my terms. "I'm sorry," he began. "I know those words aren't enough, but I need you to know how truly, deeply sorry I am for everything. I didn't realize how controlling I had become, how I was stifling you. Losing you was the wake-up call I needed." As he spoke, I felt the familiar pull. Derek had always been good with words, knowing exactly what to say to draw me back in, but this time, I steeled myself against it. "I'm glad you're working on yourself," I said carefully, "but it doesn't change anything between us. We're over, Derek. You need to accept that and move on." His expression darkened, just for a moment, but long enough to send a chill down my spine. "I can't accept that," he said, his voice low and intense. "We're meant to be together, Emily. I know you feel it too. Just give me another chance. Let me prove to you how much I've changed." I shook my head, taking a step back. "No, Derek. My decision is final. Please, just go." For a moment, I thought he might argue further, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll go. But this isn't over, Emily. We're not over." As I watched him walk back to his car, a sense of unease settled over me. Something in his tone, in the set of his shoulders, told me this wasn't the end. I spent a restless night, jumping at every sound, half expecting to see Derek's face at the window. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved to see his car gone from the driveway. But my relief was short-lived. As I went about my day trying to recapture the peace I had found before Derek's arrival, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. More than once, I caught a glimpse of movement in the trees surrounding the cabin, only to find nothing when I looked closer. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard a noise on the porch. My heart leapt into my throat as I cautiously approached the door. There, on the welcome mat, was a bouquet of red roses, my favorite. Attached was a note in Derek's handwriting: "I'll never give up on us." I slammed and locked the door, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. This time, I didn't hesitate to call the police. The officers who responded were sympathetic but limited in what they could do. Derek hadn't explicitly threatened me, and leaving flowers wasn't a crime. They promised to increase patrols in the area and advised me to document any further incidents. As they left, one of the officers turned back. "You might want to consider going somewhere else," he said gently. "Somewhere he doesn't know about." But the thought of leaving, of letting Derek chase me from my sanctuary, made me angry. This was my safe place, my chance to rediscover myself. I refused to let him take that from me. Over the next few days, Derek's presence became a constant, suffocating weight. More flowers appeared. My tires were mysteriously slashed. One morning, I woke to find all the windows of the cabin covered in post-it notes, each bearing the same message: "We belong together." I felt like I was losing my mind. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the woods, sent my heart racing. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, spending nights huddled in the living room, jumping at shadows. On the 5th day, I'd had enough. I called my brother, explaining the situation through tears of frustration and fear. He promised to come get me the next day to help me find somewhere safe. That night, as I packed my bags, a sense of defeat weighed heavily on me. Derek had won, in a way. He had taken this place from me, tainted it with fear and paranoia. As I zipped up my suitcase, a floorboard creaked behind me. Before I could turn, strong arms wrapped around me, a familiar cologne filling my nostrils. "I told you we weren't over," Derek whispered in my ear. In that moment, terror and rage exploded within me. With strength I didn't know I possessed, I drove my elbow back into his solar plexus. As he doubled over, gasping, I ran. Out of the bedroom, through the living room, fumbling with the front door lock. I could hear Derek behind me, recovering, calling my name. I burst out onto the porch and kept running, the cool night air whipping at my face. I had no plan, no destination in mind. All I knew was that I had to get away. As I ran, my feet pounding against the forest floor, I felt a strange sense of exhilaration mixing with my fear. For too long, I had been running from confrontation, from the hard truths of my relationship with Derek. But now, I was running towards something, towards freedom, towards a future where I was in control. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, where by some miracle, a car was passing. The driver, an older woman with kind eyes, took one look at my terrified face and offered me a ride to the nearest town. As we drove away, leaving Derek in the cabin behind, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. My peaceful retreat had turned into a nightmare, but it had also been the crucible I needed to find my strength again. I knew the journey wasn't over. There would be police reports to file, restraining orders to obtain, therapy to undergo. But as I watched the sun begin to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I felt ready to face whatever came next. Derek had tried to trap me in our past, but I was finally, truly, moving forward. The day I found my diary entries rewritten was the day I began to question my own sanity. It wasn't just a few words changed here and there. Entire events had been altered, memories rewritten in my own handwriting. As I delved deeper into the mystery, I realized that the person I thought I was might be nothing more than an elaborate fiction. I've always been a faithful diarist. Every night before bed, I'd jot down the day's events, my thoughts, my fears, my hopes. It was a habit I'd maintained since childhood, a way to process my life and keep my memories intact. My collection of journals stretched back years, each one a time capsule of a different version of myself. That fateful morning, I was looking for an old recipe I remembered writing down. I pulled out a journal from 2 years ago, flipping through the pages, enjoying the trip down memory lane. That's when I saw it. An entry about a party I'd attended, but the details were all wrong. In my memory, and in my original entry, it had been a disaster. I'd spilled wine on my new dress, said the wrong thing to my crush, and left early in embarrassment. But this entry described a night of triumph. In this version, I'd charmed everyone with my wit, danced the night away, and even shared a kiss with the very person I'd embarrassed myself in front of in reality. I stared at the page, my heart racing. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, down to the little flourish I always put on my Ys. But the content, it was as if someone had taken my memories and twisted them into a more palatable version. Confused and more than a little scared, I began to flip through more of my journals. With each page, my sense of unease grew. So many entries had been changed, small things at first. A bad grade turned into a good one, an argument with a friend rewritten as a heart-to-heart talk. But as I delved into more recent journals, the changes became more significant. The weekend I remembered spending alone, crying over a breakup, was now filled with adventures with friends. The job I'd been rejected from. According to this new version, I'd turned them down for a better offer. Even my relationships were different. People I remembered drifting apart from were now described as close confidants. I felt like I was losing my mind. How could this be happening? Had I somehow blocked out the real memories and invented these less flattering versions, or was someone gaslighting me on an epic scale, somehow mimicking my handwriting perfectly? I needed to know more. I began to cross-reference my diary entries with other records, photos, emails, text messages. What I found only deepened the mystery. In some cases, the new diary entries matched up with evidence I found. There were photos of me at events I didn't remember attending, text messages making plans I had no recollection of. But in other cases, My original memories were supported by hard evidence. The rejection email from that job was still in my inbox, contradicting the diary entry that claimed I'd turned them down. It was as if two versions of my life were overlapping, neither one fully real or fully false. I felt like I was standing on shifting sand, unable to trust my own memories or the written record of my life. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I reached out to my best friend, Alex. We'd known each other since college, and if anyone could help me make sense of this, it would be him. I invited him over, my journals spread out on the coffee table. As I explained what I'd found, showing him the altered entries, I saw a range of emotions flicker across his face: confusion, concern, and then recognition. "Sarah," he said slowly, "those new entries, that's how I remember things happening." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex looked uncomfortable. "The party you mentioned, I remember you being the life of it. You were amazing that night. Everyone was talking about how funny and charming you were." I shook my head, unable to process what I was hearing. "But that's not what happened," I insisted. "I made a fool of myself. I left early." Alex's brow furrowed. "Sarah, is it possible that you've been remembering things wrong? That maybe these new entries are actually the truth?" I wanted to argue, to insist that I knew my own life. But a seed of doubt had been planted. If Alex's memories matched these new entries, what did that mean? Was I the one who had it all wrong? Over the next few weeks, I fell down a rabbit hole of research. I reached out to other friends, family members, even old acquaintances, asking about specific events. The results were mixed. Some confirmed my original memories, others aligned with the new diary entries. It was as if I was living in two parallel timelines, both equally real and unreal. I started seeing a therapist, hoping to make sense of what was happening. Dr. Kaufman listened patiently as I poured out my story, showing her my journals, explaining the discrepancies. "Memory is a tricky thing," she said after I'd finished. "Our brains don't record events like a video camera. We reconstruct our memories each time we recall them, and they can be influenced by our emotions, our current circumstances, even by the act of recalling them. But this is more than just misremembering," I argued. "These are complete rewrites of my life, and some of them are supported by evidence." Dr. Kaufman nodded thoughtfully. "There's a phenomenon called confabulation," she explained. "It's where people create false memories, filling in gaps in their recollection with details that seem plausible. In some cases, people can create entire false life histories, believing them to be true. The idea that I might have invented whole swaths of my life was terrifying, but it didn't explain the physical evidence that supported both versions of events. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself slipping into a kind of double life. I began to accept both versions of my memories as potentially true, existing in a state of quantum uncertainty where my past was both one thing and another until observed. I started writing my diary entries differently, acknowledging both versions of events. Today, I either stayed home and read a book, or I went hiking with friends. Both feel equally real, and I'm no longer sure which actually happened. It was maddening, but also strangely liberating. If I couldn't trust my memories, if my past was mutable, then perhaps my future was more open than I'd ever imagined. Then came the day that changed everything. I was flipping through my most recent journal when I noticed something odd, an entry for tomorrow's date. I blinked, sure I was seeing things, but no. There it was, an entire page describing a day that hadn't happened yet. With trembling hands, I read the entry. It described a normal day at work, a lunch with a friend, an evening spent watching a new TV show. Nothing extraordinary, but it was undeniably a glimpse into the future. I stayed up all night, alternating between staring at that entry and pacing my apartment. Was this a premonition? A hallucination? Had I finally cracked under the stress of my shifting reality? When morning came, I decided to put it to the test. I followed the schedule laid out in the entry exactly. I went to work, had lunch with the friend mentioned, who had, indeed, called to make plans just as the entry said, and spent the evening watching the show described. Every detail matched. It was as if I had lived the day twice, once in writing and once in reality. From that day on, I found entries for future dates appearing regularly in my journal, sometimes just a day ahead, sometimes weeks or even months. They didn't appear for every day, and they weren't always accurate. It seemed the future could be changed, unlike my rewritten past. I realized then that my journals weren't just records of my life. They were actively shaping it. The rewritten past, the premonitions of the future. Somehow, my diaries had become a conduit for altering reality itself. I don't know how or why this is happening to me. I don't know if I'm blessed or cursed, sane or crazy. All I know is that every night I sit down with my journal, my pen hovering over the page, and I wonder, am I recording my day, or am I writing my future? Am I remembering my past, or am I rewriting it? In the end, I suppose it doesn't matter. My life, my memories, my future, they're all there on the pages, waiting to be written, rewritten, and lived. And isn't that, in a way, true for all of us? We are the authors of our own stories, even if we don't always realize the power of our words. So now, as I put pen to paper each night, I do so with intention. I write the life I want to live, the person I want to be. And in doing so, I've found a strange kind of peace. After all, if reality is mutable, if the past can be rewritten and the future foretold, then anything is possible. And that, I've discovered, is both the most terrifying and the most liberating truth of all. The unmarked package arrived on a Tuesday. Inside, nestled in crumpled newspaper, was a small black device that would shatter my sense of privacy and turn my life into a waking nightmare. I remember staring at the plain brown box on my desk, puzzled by its lack of return address or any identifying marks. It wasn't unusual for me to receive packages. Working in product development meant I often got prototypes or samples sent to the office, but this was different. There was something off about it. With a mix of curiosity and unease, I carefully opened the box. The device inside looked innocuous enough, a sleek black rectangle about the size of a deck of cards, with a single small lens on one side. At first glance, it could have been a new model of portable camera or perhaps some kind of sensor. But then I saw the note, scrawled in messy handwriting on a scrap of paper. I know your secrets. Press play if you dare. My heart began to race. This had to be some kind of joke, right? A prank from a coworker, maybe. But as I turned the device over in my hands, a chill ran down my spine. There was something deeply unsettling about it, a weight that seemed at odds with its small size. With trembling fingers, I found the power button and pressed it. The device hummed to life, a small screen flickering on. For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then, the image cleared, and I felt the blood drain from my face. It was me, sitting at my desk, in this very office, from an angle that seemed to be coming from the potted plant in the corner. The timestamp in the corner showed it was from 3 days ago. I watched, horrified, as the me on the screen went about my day, talking on the phone, typing at my computer, eating lunch at my desk. It was all so mundane, and yet so terribly invasive. Someone had been watching me, recording my every move without my knowledge. The footage continued, showing me in various locations around the office. In the break room, chatting with colleagues. In the conference room during a meeting. Even in the hallway outside the restrooms. The camera seemed to be everywhere, capturing everything. But it wasn't just at work. The next clip showed me at home, cooking dinner in my kitchen. Then in my living room, watching TV, even in my bedroom, getting ready for bed. My private life, laid bare on this tiny screen. I felt sick. How long had this been going on? How many cameras were there? And who was behind this? With shaking hands, I turned off the device and shoved it back into the box. I needed to think, to figure out what to do next. But my mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, jumping at every sound, eyeing every object in my office with suspicion. Was that pen a camera? That light fixture? The fire alarm? Nowhere felt safe anymore. When I finally got home that evening, I tore my apartment apart, searching for hidden cameras. I found nothing, but that didn't ease my paranoia. If anything, it made it worse. The cameras were there, I was sure of it. I just couldn't find them. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining hidden lenses watching me from every shadow. When I did manage to drift off, my dreams were filled with faceless observers and inescapable gazes. The next day, I went to the police. I brought the device with me, hoping they could trace it or find fingerprints. The officer I spoke to seemed concerned, but not as alarmed as I felt he should be. He took my statement, bagged the device as evidence, and told me they'd be in touch. But days passed, and I heard nothing. My calls to the station were met with vague assurances that they were looking into it. I felt helpless, abandoned by the very people who were supposed to protect me. In desperation, I turned to private security firms. I had cameras of my own installed, ones I could control, ones that made me feel a little safer. I changed my locks, added extra bolts. I even hired a company to sweep my home and office for bugs or hidden devices. They found nothing. The rational part of my brain tried to tell me that this was good news. If there were no hidden cameras, then maybe the footage on that device was all there was. Maybe it was over. But the part of me that had watched those videos, that had seen my private moments played back on that tiny screen, couldn't accept that. The cameras were there. They had to be. I just wasn't finding them. My work began to suffer. I couldn't concentrate, constantly scanning my surroundings for any sign of surveillance. My colleagues noticed, shooting me concerned glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I overheard whispers, caught snippets of conversations about my erratic behavior. I knew how I must look to them, paranoid, unstable, but they hadn't seen what I had seen. They didn't know what it was like to have your privacy stripped away, to feel exposed and vulnerable every waking moment. Weeks passed, and no more packages arrived, no more footage surfaced. But rather than feeling relieved, I grew more anxious. What was the purpose of sending me that device? Was it a warning, a threat, or merely the opening move in some twisted game? I started seeing a therapist, hoping to find some way to cope with the constant anxiety. Dr. Larson was kind and patient, listening as I poured out my fears. She suggested that perhaps the stress of the situation was causing me to imagine threats that weren't there. That maybe, just maybe, I was letting my fear run away with me. Part of me wanted to believe her. It would be so much easier if this was all in my head, if I could just let it go and move on. But every time I started to think that way, I'd remember those videos, the crystal clear footage of my most private moments. That was real. I hadn't imagined that. 2 months after receiving the package, I was a shell of my former self. I'd lost weight, dark circles permanently etched under my eyes from lack of sleep. I'd taken a leave of absence from work, unable to bear the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. It was on a rainy Tuesday evening, exactly 8 weeks since that first package had arrived, that everything changed again. I was huddled on my couch, half-heartedly flipping through a book, when I heard it. A soft thud from my front porch. My heart began to race. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. There, on my welcome mat, was another plain brown box. For a long moment, I just stared at it. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but a larger part needed to know. With trembling hands, I opened the door and brought the package inside. This box was heavier than the first. When I opened it, I found it full of USB drives, each labeled with a date. With a sense of dread, I plugged the first one into my laptop. More footage. Hundreds of hours of it. Me at work, at home, out with friends. Every aspect of my life for the past year, recorded and categorized. But it wasn't just me. There were videos of my parents at their home, my sister at her college dorm, my best friend at his job. Everyone I cared about, everyone I loved, had been under surveillance too. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about me. Whoever was behind this had targeted my entire life, everyone in it. The scope of the invasion was staggering. As I sat there, surrounded by the evidence of this massive breach of privacy, a strange calm settled over me. The panic and fear of the past weeks faded, replaced by a cold, hard anger. Enough was enough. I was done being a victim, done letting this unseen watcher control my life. It was time to fight back. I spent the next few days poring over the footage, looking for any clue, any hint about who might be behind this. I created timelines, made notes of every location shown, every person who appeared. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Certain angles that were favored, specific locations that seemed to be focal points. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I reached out to a friend who worked in IT security, swearing him to secrecy before showing him what I'd found. Together, we began to trace the digital footprints left behind by the surveillance. It's been 3 months since that second package arrived. I won't say we've solved the mystery, not yet, but we're close. I can feel it. Every day brings us one step closer to unmasking the person behind this. I still check for cameras everywhere I go. I still have trouble sleeping some nights. But I'm not afraid anymore. Instead, I'm determined. Determined to reclaim my life, to bring this shadowy watcher into the light. They thought they could break me with their surveillance, their invasion of my privacy. Instead, they've created their own worst nightmare. Someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain by exposing them. So to the person who sent me that first package, who thought they could control me with fear, I have a message. I know you're watching, but now I'm watching too, and I'm coming for you. The first postcard arrived on a Tuesday. Harmless enough, I thought, until I realized the sender knew things about me they shouldn't, things no stranger could possibly know. I remember that day clearly. It was early autumn, the kind of crisp morning that makes you grateful for a warm cup of coffee. I was sorting through my mail at the kitchen table, tossing aside bills and flyers, when I came across it. A simple postcard, nothing fancy, just a generic landscape shot of some mountains I didn't recognize. At first, I almost threw it away with the junk mail, but something made me turn it over. That's when I saw the message, written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Hope you enjoyed your morning run. The red shoes suit you. I froze, coffee cup halfway to my lips. I had gone for a run that morning, wearing my favorite red sneakers, but how could the sender know that? The postmark was from a city 3 states away, dated nearly a week ago. I chalked it up to coincidence, albeit a creepy one. Maybe it was meant for someone else and delivered to me by mistake. I tossed the postcard in a drawer and tried to forget about it, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me. Throughout the day, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning faces in the crowd for anyone who might be watching me. It was silly, I told myself. Just paranoia over a misdirected postcard. A week passed, and I had almost convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. Then the second postcard arrived. This one showed a quaint cafe I'd never seen before. I flipped it over with trembling fingers, my heart racing as I read the message. Your presentation went well today. Blue really is your color. My blood ran cold. I had given a major presentation at work that very morning, wearing my lucky blue tie. There's no way this could be a coincidence. I examined the postcard closely, looking for any clue about the sender. The postmark was from a different city this time, but still days old. How could they know about events that hadn't happened when the card was sent? Over the next few weeks, more postcards arrived. Each one bore a different picturesque scene, always from places I'd never been, and each message contained some intimate detail about my life. The new haircut looks great on you. I bet that argument with your sister was tough. Family can be complicated. Careful with that ankle. Maybe skip tomorrow's run. Every card was postmarked from a different city, always dated before the events they described. It was as if the sender could see into my future, knew my every move before I made it. I became obsessed with the postcards. I pinned them to a corkboard in my office, trying to find patterns, clues, anything that might lead me to the sender. I Googled the locations, but they were all generic tourist spots, nothing that connected them. I started changing my routine, making spontaneous decisions, anything to throw off my unseen watcher. But the postcards kept coming, always one step ahead. Nice try with the detour. The park is lovely this time of year, isn't it? I couldn't sleep. Every time I left the house, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I scrutinized every stranger, wondering if they were the ones sending the cards. Was it the barista who made my morning coffee? The neighbor I barely knew? Some old acquaintance with a grudge? I went to the police, but they were little help. Without any explicit threats, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I change my mailing address, but something told me that wouldn't stop the postcards from finding me. In desperation, I hired a private investigator. She was skeptical at first, but as the postcards continued to arrive, predicting events with uncanny accuracy, even she became unnerved. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted, poring over the collection of cards spread across her desk. "It's like they're always watching you, but from the future, it doesn't make sense." We tried everything, setting up surveillance cameras around my house, having my mail screened, even sending me to stay with friends in another state. But no matter where I went or what precautions we took, the postcards found me. The messages grew more personal, more intrusive. "You really should call your mother more often. She misses you. That rash looks uncomfortable. Tea tree oil might help. I know you're afraid. You should be." That last one broke me. I stopped going to work, stopped seeing friends. I holed up in my apartment, curtains drawn, jumping at every sound. The postcards still came, slipped under my door now instead of through the mail. "You can't hide forever," one read. "I'll always find you." I was a prisoner in my own home, tormented by these messages from an omniscient stalker. How could I fight someone who always seemed to be 10 steps ahead? Months passed. I lost my job, lost touch with friends and family. My whole world narrowed to the space between my front door and the mailbox, where I'd retrieve each new postcard with shaking hands. Then, on a gray Wednesday morning, something changed. I opened my door to find not a postcard, but a letter, a real letter, in a crisp white envelope with my name written in that now familiar handwriting. For a long time, I just stared at it, afraid to open it. What fresh horror would this bring? But curiosity finally won out over fear. Inside was a single sheet of paper. As I unfolded it, something fell out, a small key. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand as I read the letter. "By now, you must have so many questions. It's time for answers. The key opens a locker at the train station. Go there at midnight tonight. Come alone, or you'll never know the truth." I must have read those words 100 times, my mind reeling. This was it, the chance to confront my tormentor, to finally understand why this was happening to me. But could I trust it? What if it was a trap? In the end, my need for answers outweighed my fear. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I found myself at the deserted train station, key in hand. The locker was easy to find. My fingers trembled as I inserted the key, half expecting an explosion or some other calamity. But when I opened the door, I found only a small, leather-bound journal. I opened it, and my world tilted on its axis. The handwriting inside matched the postcards perfectly. But it wasn't just someone's diary, it was mine. Pages and pages filled with my own thoughts, my own experiences, things that hadn't happened yet. The final entry was dated 5 years in the future. It detailed how I discovered time travel, how I used it to send messages to my past self, trying to prepare me for what was to come. My head spun. It was impossible, and yet, it explained everything. The postmarks predating events, the impossible knowledge of my daily life. I had been stalking myself. As I stood there, journal clutched to my chest, a figure emerged from the shadows. I knew who it was before they stepped into the light. It was me. Older, wearier, but unmistakably me. "I'm sorry," my future self said, voice heavy with regret. "I thought I was helping, preparing you, but I see now I only caused pain." "Why?" I managed to choke out. "Why do all this?" I sighed deeply. "To prevent a tragedy, one that would reshape our entire world." But I realized too late that by trying to change the past, I was causing the very future I was trying to prevent. We talked for hours. There in that empty train station, she told me of the years to come, of discoveries and losses, of a world on the brink of chaos. "What happens now?" I asked, as dawn began to break. "Now, we let things unfold as they should," she replied. "No more postcards, no more interference. What will be, will be." And with that, she was gone, leaving me alone with the journal and a head full of impossible knowledge. I'd like to say things went back to normal after that night. But how could they? I had glimpsed a future that may or may not come to pass, spoken with a version of myself I hoped I'd never become. The postcard stopped, true to her word, but the experience left an indelible mark on me. I find myself hyper-aware of every choice, every action, wondering if it's leading me toward or away from that haunted future self. Sometimes, I'm tempted to burn the journal, to erase that knowledge and live freely, but I can't bring myself to do it. It serves as a reminder of the fragility of time, of the weight our choices carry, and of the dangers of trying to outsmart fate. And every so often, when I pass a postcard rack, I feel a chill run down my spine. I can't help but wonder, is this where it begins? The first time I heard my name whispered from an empty room, I dismissed it as my imagination. But as the disembodied voice grew louder and more insistent, I realized that the walls of my home held secrets far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. It started on a Tuesday night. I remember because I'd just settled in to watch the latest episode of my favorite true crime series. The house was quiet, save for the low murmur of the TV and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. I was alone, as I often was since my divorce 6 months prior. As the show went to a commercial break, I heard it, a whisper, so faint I almost missed it. "Sarah," it said. My name carried on a breath of air. I muted the TV, cocking my head to listen. Nothing, just the usual nighttime sounds of the house settling. I shrugged it off, blaming it on my overstimulated imagination. True crime shows had a way of making you jumpy, but then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Each time, my name, whispered from a different part of the house, from the kitchen while I was in the living room, from the upstairs hallway while I was in the bathroom, always when I was alone, always just out of sight. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind, somehow finding its way through the cracks in this old house and creating sounds that only seemed like words. Or perhaps it was a neighbor's TV, the audio somehow carrying through the walls in a way that sounded like my name. But as the days passed and the whispers continued, I found it harder to dismiss. They were becoming clearer, more distinct. And there was something about the voice that nagged at me, a familiarity I couldn't quite place. I started avoiding empty rooms, keeping the TV or music on constantly to drown out any potential whispers. I bought a white noise machine for my bedroom, hoping it would help me sleep through the night without being jolted awake by my name being called from the darkness. It didn't help. If anything, the voice seemed to grow stronger, more insistent. It started saying other things too, not just my name. "Help me," it would plead. Or sometimes, more ominously, "I'm coming." I reached out to friends, trying to casually bring up the subject of hearing things in an old house. They laughed, sharing their own stories of creaky pipes and settling foundations. But none of their experiences came close to what I was dealing with. In desperation, I called a local paranormal investigation team. They came, armed with EMF detectors and spirit boxes. They spent a night in my house, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Sometimes old houses just make strange noises, the lead investigator told me with a sympathetic smile. I wanted to scream. This wasn't just strange noises. This was a voice on clear as day calling my name. As weeks turned into months, I felt like I was losing my mind. I couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate at work. Every moment at home was spent in a state of hypervigilance and waiting for the next whisper, the next call of my name. Then came the night that changed everything. I had finally managed to fall into a fitful sleep when I was jolted awake by my name being called. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream, agonized and terrified, coming from right beside my bed. I scrambled out of bed, heart pounding, and flicked on the light. The room was empty, of course. But as I stood there, trembling, I noticed something on my dresser mirror. Words, written in the condensation as if someone had breathed on the glass. "Remember me." And suddenly, I did. The familiarity of the voice, the reason it had been nagging at me all this time. It was my own voice. Memories came flooding back, memories I had suppressed for years. This house, my childhood home, the accidents, the near misses, the time I almost drowned in the bathtub, the close call with the faulty electrical outlet in my bedroom. Each time, saved at the last moment by what I had always assumed was luck. But it wasn't luck. It was me. Or rather, other versions of me. Versions that hadn't been so fortunate. Versions that had died in this house, their spirits trapped within its walls. As this realization washed over me, the whispers grew to a crescendo. Dozens of voices, all mine, all calling out at once. Some pleading for help, others warning of danger, still others simply crying out in eternal anguish. I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the cacophony of my own voice coming from every corner of the house. How had I forgotten? How had I let myself move back into this house, the site of so many near-death experiences? In that moment, I understood why I had been drawn back here after my divorce. Some part of me had known, had been trying to remember. The other versions of me, the ones who hadn't survived, they had been trying to warn me all along. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I couldn't stay in this house, couldn't live with the constant reminders of my own mortality echoing through the halls. But I couldn't simply leave either. These other versions of me, these lost possibilities, they deserved peace. Over the next weeks, I threw myself into researching the history of the house. I discovered that it had been built on the site of an old well, long since filled in and forgotten. Local legends spoke of the well being a thin place, a spot where the veil between worlds was weaker. Armed with this knowledge, I sought out a medium, not the TV psychic type, but an old woman who lived on the outskirts of town, someone the locals spoke of in hushed, respectful tones. She came to the house, her ancient eyes taking in every detail. As soon as she crossed the threshold, she gasped. "Oh, child," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "What a burden you've been carrying." For hours, she moved through the house, murmuring in a language I didn't understand. The whispers grew agitated, swirling around us like a tornado of sound. But the old woman stood firm, her voice rising to match the cacophony. As the sun began to set, a change came over the house. The whispers quieted, then fell silent. A sense of peace settled over everything, a weight lifting that I hadn't even realized was there. The medium turned to me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "They're at rest now," she said softly. "All those possible yous, they've moved on. But they wanted you to know something." I held my breath, waiting. "They said to live," she continued. "Live for all of them. Live the life they never got the chance to." That night, for the first time in months, I slept soundly. No whispers, no screams. Just the quiet of a house, finally at peace. In the morning, I put the house up for sale. I couldn't stay, not with the memories of what had happened, what could have happened, but as I packed up my belongings, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. I had been given a second chance. No, more than that. I had been given dozens of second chances, each one paid for by a version of myself that hadn't been so lucky. I owed it to them to make the most of this life. As I locked the door for the last time, I could have sworn I heard one final whisper, not my name this time, but two simple words: "Thank you." I smiled, feeling a sense of closure wash over me. The voices were gone, but their message remained. Live. Live for all of us. And that's exactly what I intend to do. The first time I noticed my favorite mug had moved from its usual spot, I brushed it off as forgetfulness. But when my carefully arranged bookshelf was subtly reorganized overnight, I knew something was terribly wrong in my home. Someone, or something, was altering my space, and I seemed to be the only one who noticed. It started innocuously enough. I'm a creature of habit, and my morning routine is sacred. Coffee mug on the right side of the sink, ready for its daily brew. So when I reached for it one bleary-eyed Tuesday and found it on the left, I was momentarily confused. Had I absent-mindedly moved it the night before? Possible, but unlikely. I shrugged it off and went about my day. But then it happened again, and again. Small things, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. The throw pillow on my couch rotated 45 degrees, my keys on a different hook by the door. The plant in the corner shifted an inch to the left. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. I started taking photos of my apartment before I left for work, comparing them to how things looked when I returned. The changes were subtle but undeniable. Someone was in my space, touching my things, but never taking anything. I changed the locks. I set up a nanny cam disguised as a potted plant. I even sprinkled talcum powder on the floor one night, hoping to catch footprints, but every morning the camera showed nothing. The powder was undisturbed, and yet things had moved. The day I found my bookshelf reorganized was when the true fear set in. I'm meticulous about my books, organizing them by genre and then author. But that morning, they were arranged by color, creating a rainbow effect that was aesthetically pleasing, but utterly foreign to my system. It had taken hours to set up my preferred arrangement. This wasn't a small, accidental shift. This was deliberate. I called the police, but they were skeptical. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no evidence of an intruder. They suggested I might be sleepwalking or experiencing memory issues due to stress. They recommended a psychiatrist. But I knew I wasn't crazy. I started sleeping on the couch, facing the room, determined to catch whatever was happening. For 3 nights, nothing changed. On the 4th night, I awoke to the sound of a book being slid back onto the shelf. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding. The room was dark, but in the faint light from the street lamps outside, I saw a figure standing by my bookshelf. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its movements fluid like water as it rearranged my books. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed. Whether from fear or some unseen force, I couldn't tell. The figure turned slowly, and in the dim light I saw nothing. Where a face should have been was just a blank expanse of skin. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and I was alone. The bookshelf had been rearranged again, this time by book size. I spent the day in a daze, questioning my sanity. Had it been a dream? A hallucination brought on by lack of sleep and paranoia? But the books were undeniably reorganized. It had happened. That night, I set up my phone to record the room. I didn't sleep, my eyes glued to the darkness, waiting. Around 3 a.m., I saw it again, the figure emerging from the shadows as if it was made of them. This time, it moved to my desk, rearranging the items there with meticulous care. I watched, terrified but fascinated, as it worked. Its movements were precise, almost beautiful in their fluidity. When it finished, it turned towards me. I felt its gaze, even though it had no eyes. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it melted back into the shadows. In the morning, I checked my phone, hands shaking. The recording showed nothing, just an empty room, unchanged throughout the night. But my desk had been reorganized, each item placed with geometric precision. I didn't go to work that day, or the next. I spent hours researching, trying to find any explanation for what was happening. Ghosts? Interdimensional beings? Some kind of bizarre sleepwalking disorder? Nothing fit. I started leaving notes for the entity. Who are you? What do you want? Why are you here? Each morning, the notes were untouched, but rearranged into neat stacks or folded into origami shapes. Weeks passed. I grew accustomed to the nightly visits, even started to anticipate them. The entity never harmed me, never took anything. It just organized. Endlessly, meticulously organized. I began to notice patterns in its work. It seemed to prefer symmetry, balance. I started experimenting, intentionally leaving things askew or disorganized. The entity always corrected them, bringing order to chaos. One night, unable to sleep, I spoke to it. "Thank you," I said softly as it arranged my collection of seashells into a perfect spiral. "It looks beautiful." The entity paused, its featureless face turning towards me. For a long moment, it was perfectly still. Then, slowly, it nodded. From that night on, things changed. The entity became more interactive. It would pause in its work if I spoke, tilting its head as if listening. It never spoke back, never made a sound, but I felt acknowledged. I started leaving more complex puzzles for it, Rubik's cubes, tangrams, logic problems. Each morning, I'd find them solved, often in ways I hadn't even considered. My fear gradually gave way to curiosity, even a strange sort of affection. I found myself looking forward to the nightly visits, wondering what the entity would organize next. But as my comfort with the entity grew, so did my isolation from the outside world. How could I explain to anyone what was happening in my apartment each night? Who would believe me? I stopped inviting friends over, made excuses to avoid family visits. My world narrowed to my apartment and its nightly visitor. Months passed. The entity's visits became the center of my life. I'd rush home from work, eager to see what it had rearranged, what new patterns it had created. I started buying new objects just to see how it would organize them. One night, I decided to stay up and watch it work. As usual, it emerged from the shadows around 3 a.m., but this time, instead of starting its usual reorganization, it turned to me. Slowly, gracefully, it extended a hand towards me. An invitation. My heart raced. This was new, unprecedented. For a long moment, I hesitated. Then, almost without conscious thought, I reached out and took its hand. Its touch was cool, neither solid nor insubstantial. As our hands connected, the world around us seemed to shift. The shadows in the room deepened, swirled, became almost liquid. The entity tugged gently, and I stood. Together we walked towards the darkest corner of the room. With each step, the world as I knew it seemed to fade away, replaced by a realm of shifting shadows and geometric patterns. I should have been terrified, but instead, I felt a profound sense of rightness, of coming home. I understood then that the entity hadn't been invading my space all these months. It had been preparing me, teaching me to see the patterns, the order underlying everything. As we stepped fully into the shadow realm, I felt myself changing, my form becoming fluid, my senses expanding. I could see the patterns now, not just in my small apartment, but in the entire world. The elegant mathematics of leaves growing on a tree, the complex dance of subatomic particles, the grand symmetry of galaxies. I turned to the entity, my teacher, my guide, and for the first time, I truly saw it. Not a featureless face, but a being of pure geometry, a living embodiment of the patterns that underlie all of existence. It nodded to me, a gesture of welcome and acknowledgement. Then together, we set out into this new realm, ready to bring order to chaos, to find and create beauty in the endless patterns of the universe. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I think about my old life, the apartment I left behind, the world I once knew. I wonder if someone else lives there now, if they've noticed small things moving in the night, and I smile, knowing that somewhere out there, another entity is emerging from the shadows, ready to teach, to guide, to reveal the hidden order in all things, just as I do now, in this realm of endless patterns and infinite possibilities.